We do a online script introduction just for the record. So I'll read through that. We'll do introductions and a rundown of the day, and then we'll start with the presentation.
Good.
So I will take a breath. Kate, are we waiting on, we're waiting on Sloan and Lita, is that correct?
Yes, I know Sloan will join us. I'm not sure about Lita. She's deep into engagement, but she'll probably try to pop in.
Okay. And who will be leading the presentation this morning?
Yes, we've got a few folks. I will do a quick intro. Emily will be walking through the DEAS findings overview. I know then we have some city slides from Vera, and then Dirk Baker will be presenting on the structures, and then Sloan Dawson will present on the stations.
Got it.
Got quite an array today.
Yeah, well, no, I appreciate it. I'm sure that it'll add to a rich discussion. Do you think it's okay for me to go ahead and start or kick the meeting off? Or should we wait for a minute, a couple of, oh, here's
I see Sloan and Dirk just joined, so I think we're ready to go. Yeah. I'm not sure about Vera, if Vera's on yet, but
she is on.
It's here. Oh, okay, great.
Well, perfect. I am going to go ahead and kick the meeting off. We're starting the recording. I want to welcome people to the March 17th, 2022 online meeting of the Seattle Design Commission. Our meetings are designed to meet the governor's executive orders allowing online meetings during the COVID pandemic. Our meetings are being recorded through WebEx to be posted later on our website. Our meeting agenda today, this morning, where we'll be getting a presentation from Sound Transit on elements of the West Seattle to Ballard light rail extension that segment from Ballard to presenters this morning from Sound Transit, and our discussion by our chair.
You're cutting out a little bit, Michael.
Sorry, is that better? We have lunch from 12:30 until 1, and then from 1 until 2, there will be a time for commission business. In terms of today's meeting format, the team will provide a briefing on the proposal. There will be an opportunity for public comment as well, which we'll discuss in just a minute. During the meeting today, commissioners will provide comments on each option highlighted in the presentations today that are also options that are disclosed in Sound Transit's draft environmental impact statement. They'll also ask clarifying questions concurrently with their discussion and provide comments and flag issues concurrently. In terms of opportunity for public comment, the WebEx does allow for the public to participate in real time. We'll have an opportunity for public comment after the presentations. For members of the public, we'd like you to sign up on the sign-up sheet that's attached to the meeting agenda, and we'll also recognize people through the WebEx hand-raising function. Why don't we go ahead and start with introductions of commissioners in alphabetic order by first name. If you could also indicate your position on the commission, and then we'll follow with introductions by the project team. And if we can make sure that we mute when we're not speaking, that'd be great. I think we'll be starting with Elaine Wine. Elaine.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Elaine Wine, one of the architect commissioners.
Elizabeth Connor, artist commissioner, and I'm passing along to Erica if I'm not mistaken.
Hi, I'm Erica, urban design commissioner. Nice to see you all. And I'll pass over to Molly.
All right, I'm Molly Spitalnik. I'm the Get Engaged commissioner and an urban designer, and I'll pass it to Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Alfs, architect commissioner. And is that over to Vanita?
Yeah, we have to learn our new alphabetical order, I guess. But yeah, I'm always last, so it's easy. Good morning, Vanita Sidhu, landscape architect commissioner and chair.
Thank you, Vanita. Kate, could you lead introductions with the Sound Transit team?
Yes, I will. Thank you. I'll just start. My name's Kate Lichtenstein. I'm in an acting project director role representing planning on the West Seattle Ballard project from Sound Transit. I'll pass it over to Emily Yasakochi.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Emily Yasakochi. I am the segment manager for the Interbay Ballard segment on the West Seattle and Ballard project team at Sound Transit. And I will pass it to Dirk.
My name is Dirk Baker, and with Sound Transit, I'm the design manager for the entire alignment. And I'll pass it on to Sloan.
Good morning, everyone. Sloan Dawson, Station Planning and Urban Design on the West Seattle Ballard Link Extension project. And I think that's our full ST team. I might pass it now to Vera to introduce city team.
Thanks, Tats, though, there, Sloan.
Oh,
I'm sorry, what?
go ahead, Tats.
Tats is there for Sound Transit.
I'm sorry, Tots. Tots, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, Tats Tanaka, Sound Transit, architecture lead.
Thanks, Tats. Vera, we've been, and panelists and members today, we've been joined by a number of people from the city family. Vera, could you lead us through introductions? And I've made Jeff and Jim panelists.
Thank you so much. We also add Gabriel. Gabriel just joined.
Sure.
He's an attendee at the moment. So hi, everyone. I'm Vera Jumpcatcher. I know we have a couple of new design commissioners. The rest of the design commission has seen a lot of us lately, but I'll just share who I am. I am a planner with OPCD, the city's Office of Planning and Community Development, and I lead up the planning work group, excuse me, for the West Seattle Ballard Link Extensions project. And my director is here, Rico Kirindongo. Would you like to introduce yourself? We have new commissioners today.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the new commissioners. I see some familiar faces there. Rico Kirindongo, Acting Director, Office of Planning and Community Development. Excited for this presentation from Sound Transit today.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we also have Jeff Wentland from OPCD. Jeff, if you would introduce yourself.
Good morning, commissioners. Jeff Wentland. I'm the Land Use Policy Manager in the Office of Planning and Community Developments.
Great, thank you, Jeff. We also have Gabriel Seo from ESTA, Urban Design. Gabriel, you want to introduce yourself?
Good thing. Good morning, everybody. Gabriel Seo, one of the urban designers in ESTA.
Great. And then Colin Drake is also here. Michael, would you be willing to make him a presenter as well?
I will. I need to find that button, but I will get on it. I might not be, we may have to go ahead. I'm looking for it. I lost that button, but sorry, Colin. I'll get you there in a minute.
Colin will be speaking to some of our slides later, and maybe Colin, when you get there, you can introduce yourself. I'm sorry we didn't have you on the presenter list this morning. And I'll pass it back, unless I missed anyone. I don't think I did. That's all of our city folks who are here today. I'll pass it back.
Great, thank you. With that, I think we will go ahead and Kate, if you could kick off the presentation again. We have you until 12:30 today, at which time we have a hard stop. So we need to make sure that we're careful to make sure that we're on time. I will go ahead and mute, and I'll throw it to you, Kate. Kate, you may be on mute. Kate, are you on mute?
She's not showing up as muted, but there are sort of double. I know there's a second place that I've heard people talk about. Wait, so now she.
I just unmuted you, Kate.
If you'd like, I can go ahead and get us started.
Great, thank you, Sloan.
Sorry about that. I don't know why the tech difficulty today. So, good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all again. We have a really big agenda today to talk about the Interbay Ballard segment. Two of the stations which you've asked us to focus on, Smith Cove and Ballard, and of course the guideway structures and the bridges that cross Salmon Bay. So this is our agenda. We'll spend a bit of time on project orientation, especially for the new commissioners here today, which will be useful background, and we'll also be hearing from the city on related initiatives that really affect this section of the alignment and the stations here. And we'll wrap up about 12:30 p.m. as noted. So just to provide you with a little bit of the project background, the West Seattle and Ballard Link Extensions is one of the projects, one of the flagship projects out of ST3, which was passed in 2016. Since 2017, we've been working on planning the project, so identifying alternatives to subject to environmental review to ultimately define a project to be built, which will be taken through final design and, of course, construction to reach service. And West Seattle is projected to go into service in 2032, and the Ballard line, which we're focusing on today, has a couple of dates associated with it due to the recent realignment action. The target delivery is 2037, but sort of the affordable budget cash flow timeline is 2039. And just so you're aware, these are two projects. So in our next briefing on the 7th of April, we'll be looking at the West Seattle segment and Duwamish River Crossing. That will be operationally a distinct line from the line that we're looking at today. So looking a little bit more at the planning phase that we've been in alternatives development from 2017 to 2019 that really defined the routes and the station locations that we're going to study in the EIS. And now we've been working towards the draft EIS and just published that at the end of January. We're in the public comment period for the draft EIS. And that will close on April 28th. At which point the board will confirm or modify the preferred alternative, which we do have preferred alternatives in this segment coming out of alternatives development. The only segment where we don't have that, as we learned in our last presentation, is in the CID. So this upcoming milestone will be either a confirmation or modification of preferred alternatives or identification of preferred alternatives in the case of the CID potentially. To move us into the final EIS. And once we're through the final EIS, there will be a record of decision that identifies the project to be built and moves us into final design and construction. So as I hinted, there are several sort of categories of alternatives that the draft EIS studies. The preferred alternative is the pink line shown here. So for our segment that we're talking about today, from Smith Cove into Ballard, the preferred alternative is mostly an elevated route. We'll hear more from Emily about this shortly. We also have other draft EIS alternatives shown in blue, which are not necessarily designated as preferred, but the board identified for further study in 2019. And in our segment, we also have what's called preferred alternatives of third-party funding, which generally refers to elements that added scope beyond what ST3 projected, so i.e. tunnel alignments and stations in Ballard and in West Seattle. And this is our sort of overview of our engagement approach for the draft EIS, going from the publication, which happened at the end of January, and to that confirmation or modification of preferred alternative, which is projected in June. The comment period is the darker gray shade on this diagram. So we're about halfway through that, a little bit over halfway through the comment period right now. And in red, you can also see the community advisory groups that we've convened to help sort through the draft EIS information and provide a space for sort of stakeholder deliberation and exchange. And you can see those topics related to those meetings that have been happening throughout this comment period. And you can also see on the bottom the two board committee as well as the full board that will act in these different milestones to take in the information that we're receiving from the public and moving us forward. I'm going to turn it over to Emily Yasakochi to walk us through the alternatives.
Great, thanks, Sloan. All right, so I'm going to go over the alternatives in the Interbay Ballard area and some of the high-level draft EIS results. So first, I just want to point out, all the maps I'm going to go over will have north to the right-hand side. And just a couple things I want to point out. So the segment boundary is from downtown. It's just off the lower left side of the map. And just want to point out there's sort of two locations where this could come from. One is the pink is coming from Republican and the blue here is coming from Mercer. So those represent connections to different alternatives downtown, one to a Seattle Center Station that's on Mercer versus one that's a Seattle Center Station on Republican. So I want to point that out. And then also want to point out where it says Interbay in bold, that's another segment boundary. And so you can see there's kind of two areas where those two connect. It's either behind, kind of between the golf course and the railroads, that's one connection point, and then 15th Avenue is a different connection point. So as I go through these, you'll notice that alternatives, connect at one point or the other. And those are limitations to potential connections in the draft EIS. All right, next slide, please. So I'm going to start with some general information, including some of the project benefits and other information about the project. So this slide shows transit travel times and reliability information. So in the PM peak in 2042, the project is expected to get riders from 15th and Market in Ballard to Westlake downtown in about 11 minutes, as compared with 38 minutes by bus. And then for reliability on a Link, Link would have an A rating of reliability, while on the bus it would be an E or F in the evening peak period. Next slide is ridership. So for Smith Cove Station, ridership is anticipated to be about 2,600 average daily boardings, with most getting there by walking. For Interbay Station, ridership is forecasted at about 4,200 daily boardings, with 2/3 getting there by bus. And for Ballard Station, ridership is expected to be around 13,100 daily boardings, with just over half getting there by bus and another about 40% getting there walking or rolling. Next, we have information on transit integration. So each of these boxes has 3 rows. First, the number of routes serving the station. Next, the number of bus stop zones at the station. And then finally, the bottom line is the percent of peak hour bus trips that serve bus zones with direct access to station entrances. That is, if you get on or off the bus, if you're going between the bus and the station, you wouldn't have to cross a street and you would be within about 100 feet of an entrance. So that's what those percentages represent, percentage of peak trips that are directly accessible to station entrances. So for Smith Cove Station, there are no differentiators in terms of the bus access. So I'll just go straight to Interbay. For the 17th Avenue alternatives at the top, those have more bus trips in the PM peak that have direct access to stops compared to that 15th location. And then for the Ballard Station, the 14th Avenue station locations have all bus zones with direct access to station entrances, whereas for the 15th station locations, it's a bit lower at 63% of PM peak trips that have direct access to station entrances. And then the next slide is information on transit-oriented development potential for each alternative and station location. Because we're kind of crunched for time, I'm not going to go over these in detail, but I'll note that in developing these estimates, Sound Transit generally used current zoning designations to model potential development capacity, but in some cases, modified zoning was assumed. So with that, I will go on to the draft EIS results, and I'm going to start in South Interbay. So I'm going to go over the alternative first, and then I'll just quickly go through some of the results, but you'll probably be able to absorb a little bit while I'm talking. So the Gaylord Street Station Central Interbay alternative comes from that Republican Seattle Center station. So it continues in a tunnel after it leaves that station. And then the tunnel portal is basically at the end of Republican, basically right there before Elliott. So from that tunnel portal, the alternative would become elevated, traveling up Elliott. It crosses to immediately after the portal, it goes to the west and then crosses back to the east side, travels up the east side, and then just north of Kinnear Park, it crosses back over to the west to serve an elevated Smith Cove station located above the Gaylord Street Bridge. It would then cross over the Magnolia Bridge and continue north along the western edge of the Interbay Golf Center. And that's where it connects into the Interbay Ballard segment. So this one has a cost of approximately 1.3 billion. Sorry, I'll go over the categories. So they're similar within the segment. So each alternative in this segment will have the project cost, residential displacement. So that's units of residential displacements, historic property effects. And that's number of properties, permanent park effects, so permanent park area that would be displaced, biodiversity effects, which is essentially wildlife habitat area that would be displaced, and then roadway effects is related to the length of approximate length of guideway that would be in or near arterial roadways, so Elliott and 15th in this segment. So some alternatives have more guideway in or near the roadway, so that comes with things like columns in the roadway that would affect permanent operations at some intersections, and then also construction effects to build those. So yeah, just to point out on this one, a project cost of 1.3 billion and 174 units of residential displacements, and that's on the higher end for this segment. Next slide. So now I'll talk about the Prospect Street Station 15th Avenue alternative. So this one also would come from the Republican Seattle Center station. So it has that same portal at the end of Republican, the same guideway crossing a couple times over Elliott, but then it would come up the east side of Elliott to serve an elevated Smith Cove station just north of Prospect Street on the east side there. And then it would continue along kind of the edge of the Southwest Queen Anne Greenbelt before turning north and transitioning to the center of 15th Avenue, where it would continue up the median of 15th Avenue and connect in. So this one has a project cost of about 1.4 to 1.5 billion and is also higher on the higher side for the residential displacements. It's on the lower side for park effects, but higher for biodiversity. That's because of that guideway in the Queen Anne Greenbelt area. And this one has the most roadway effects at about a mile because it has guideway both in Elliott and in 15th. And then the other considerations in the lighter blue color, so that's just a place to put other things that are important to know about the alternatives that didn't fit into one of the categories above. And so this alternative has some guideway and station in the Queen Anne hillside, which is a steep slope ECA or environmentally critical area. And so the need to stabilize the slope there would add some complexity to this alternative. And next we have the Prospect Street Station Central Interbay alternative. So this one comes from a different Seattle Center station. It comes from the one that is located under Mercer. So it would continue underground from that station in a tunnel for a bit longer to the north. Its portal would actually be around Prospect, just around Prospect Street and Elliott on the east side. It would then serve a retained cut Smith Cove station just north of Prospect, and then curve along the bottom of the hillside there, and then turn west, go over 15th, turn west, travel up Armory and elevated guideway, and then turn north to continue along the western edge of the golf course. So this one has the highest cost of the three at about 1.5 to 1.6 billion. It also has the highest park and biodiversity effects, but the lowest residential and historic effects, and also the lowest roadway. It also, because it has the station and guideway in that Queen Anne hillside steep slope area, so it would have that a similar issue with the complexity of needing to stabilize that slope. So next is the summary slide, showing all those numbers just on one slide together, so you can kind of see them all at the same time. And just we've added some shading to these. Darker shades indicate higher performing elements, whereas lighter shades indicate lower performing elements. So I won't go over each of these, but we can maybe just pause here so you can take this in a little bit. Okay. I know I'm kind of racing through these, but we have a lot to get through. So let's move on to Interbay Ballard. So that is the segment to the north. We'll start with the elevated 14th Avenue alternative. So this one connects to those that come from the western edge of the golf course near the BNSF tracks. So it would cross over the Dravis Bridge. It would serve an elevated Interbay station just north of Dravis, and then continue on an elevated guideway northeast over the Emerson Street interchange, and then curve to the north to cross Salmon Bay on a high-level fixed span bridge. On the east side of the Ballard Bridge, it would then continue north along 14th on the Ballard side and terminate at an elevated Ballard station on 14th Avenue Northwest, straddling Market Street. So entrances on both sides of Market. This one has an estimated cost of 1.5 to 1.6 billion. And probably most important to point out here is the in-water effects. So this alternative, the 14th Avenue Bridge alternatives, have the highest in-water effects. So that has implications for underwater habitat, for navigation, for treaty protected fishing rights, we would need to relocate maritime businesses. And then some of those in-water effects are due to the need to relocate the 14th Avenue boat ramp and the stormwater outfall that's located at the 14th Street end. So let's move to the next one. So I'll go over the tunnel alternatives next. So this is the tunnel 14th Avenue alternative. It would go, it also connects back behind the golf course and athletic complex, but it would go under Dravis. And then it would serve a retained cut Interbay station just north of Dravis near 17th, similar location to the one we were just looking at, but retained cut. Then it would continue to a tunnel portal that's south of the Emerson-Nickerson interchange and west of 15th. Then it would tunnel under Salmon Bay and terminate at a Ballard station underneath 14th with stations on both sides, station entrances on both sides of Market. With estimated project cost of 1.5 billion and no in-water effects, and all of these numbers, as you'll see when they're all compared, are on the lower side of the various alternatives. Lower in quantity, higher in performance. Okay, next we'll do the tunnel 15th Avenue alternative. So this one is essentially the same. So under Dravis, same retained cut Interbay station, same tunnel portal. And then once it leaves the tunnel portal, it just would end up in a different place. So it would end up at a tunnel station on the east edge of 15th, completely south of Market Street. So entrance is only on the south side of Market. So this one has a estimated project cost of 1.7 billion. And when you see the comparison numbers, you'll see these are all on the lower side or higher performing side. All right, let's move on to the elevated 14th Avenue alignment option. So this one connects the 15th alternative south of here, so the 15th Avenue, to the 14th Bridge that we've already talked about. So this one would have an elevated Interbay station above 15th and Dravis, and then it would curve over to the northeast and then head north in that same high-level fixed bridge at 14th, same elevated 14th Avenue Ballard station. This one has a project cost of approximately 1.6 billion, and then is higher in the, I think this is the highest one in residential displacements. A lot of those are in the in some multifamily buildings in North Queen Anne. And then we've already talked over some of the water and maritime business issues, so I won't spend time on that. And we'll go to our last alternative here. That's the 15th, elevated 15th Avenue alternative. So this one also has that elevated Interbay station at 15th, over 15th and Dravis. But then it would curve to the west of the Ballard Bridge and cross Salmon Bay in a movable bridge span. And then continue north and then shift over to the east to join up with 15th, and it would end at an elevated Ballard station above 15th Avenue south of Market Street. This one has an estimated project cost of 1.5 billion. A lot of the same water related effects. This one has the eligible historic district at Fisherman's Terminal, so it would have effects there. And there would be, because it's a movable bridge span, there would be, we would expect some delays to the system when that bridge would need to open or raise for larger, taller vessels. And then this one's the highest for employee displacements, and we point out a big chunk of those are related to the displacement of a commercial complex at 15th and Market. So next we just have the summary slide. Again, same shading, so darker indicating higher performance, lighter indicating lower performance. And so, yeah, we'll just pause here again and let you take it in. And that is the end of my part. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Emily. So I'm going to turn it over to the city team now to walk through various initiatives that the City of Seattle is working through in this corridor. And Vera, it's going to start with you.
Yep. Thank you, Sloan. So you can go to the next slide. So the first thing I'll share is, this is generally for awareness of the study. The Ballard Interbay Regional Transportation System study that was completed in November of 2020. Part of the reason for sharing this is that the what we refer to as BERT is the acronym, studied replacements for, at a high level, replacements for the Ballard and Magnolia bridges, and there are a couple of alternatives for each of those bridges for replacement. And I encourage all of you to look at the actual report itself, because that can speak more fully to what occurred in this plan. But what the thesis of the study was is that there is excellent access to regional and international waterways between the Ballard and Smith Cove stations and in their vicinity, but those waterway access points are not complemented by a comparably robust system of roadway connections, and the state has been concerned about sort of viability of that corridor as serving those businesses adequately. And so this study was intended to look at ways of improving right-of-way access for freight, for other industrial uses. So as mentioned here on the slide, there were a number of agency partners involved in the study. So SDOT, King County Metro, Sound Transit, the Washington State Department of Transportation, Port of Seattle, and the Washington Military Department. And again, we can share with you the report itself for you to dive a little bit deeper onto that. And the next slide, please. So in 2019, just prior to the completion of that study, the city worked, I think many of you are familiar with the Mandatory Housing Affordability Program, and that was adopted by council in 2019. And I'm focusing on Ballard here because Ballard is one of our hub urban villages in the city, and as you know, a location for a proposed Sound Transit light rail station. And when we worked on this project, so what it involved is saying we're going to offer more development capacity primarily within urban villages, but also within our multifamily and commercial zones. And in exchange, we will require contributions to affordable housing. And what we did partly during that time is we looked at our comp plan, our most recent comp plan, which had a growth and equity analysis that said some parts of the city of Seattle seem to be at higher risk of displacement, and some parts of the city of Seattle seem to be at lower risk of displacement. And then complementary to that, we saw that some parts of the city have higher access to opportunity, and there are a bunch of metrics that sort of help evaluate what those what contribute to displacement and opportunity. And as an overarching concept for MHA, we said, okay, if we're going to add development capacity but keep an eye out for displacement, what we said is in high opportunity areas that may have a low risk of displacement, we will expand an urban village boundary. We will make meaningful changes to the zoning development capacity there. And so in Ballard, we anticipated there being a light rail station at 15th and Market, which, you know, we have more alternatives than that now. But we took that light rail station location and we said, let's draw the 5 and 10 minute walk from that station, and we will expand the urban village boundary to reflect the walk shed for the light rail station. And so you can see on this plan, there's a dashed line, a white dashed line. That was the previous urban village boundary, and we expanded it east to capture more of the urban village, or more of the walk shed for the light rail station in Ballard. It doesn't incorporate the southeast corner because that is industrial zoned area, and we were not working to grow capacity in industrial zoned areas through MHA. And we can move on to the next slide, and I'll have Jeff Wentland take it from there.
Thank you, Vera. So I have a few slides here to tell you about the industrial and maritime strategy, which is long-range land use planning that the city is currently doing. And one of the major drivers for that is to anticipate light rail and prepare a future land use vision to accommodate light rail. I have a handful of slides. I'm going to try to be brief and keep us on schedule. But for background, I'm just going to note that there are 2 regionally designated manufacturing industrial centers, and all of the 3 station areas you're looking at today are within one of those manufacturing industrial centers. So yeah, the Binmick area, the north of the map. There are over 95,000 jobs in these areas. 2/3 of those are accessible without a traditional 4-year college degree. And many of them remain unionized with high quality benefits and have great starting salaries. Also, it's important to note that deep water ports and freight and rail infrastructure are irreplaceable assets that can't be located really anywhere else. Next slide, please. So there have been many efforts to try to update the city's policies for industrial lands. They go back decades really, but there hasn't been a major update in almost 30 years. However, under Mayor Durkin, in 2019, she convened a advisory council with 60+ members from a broad cross-section of labor, port, residential community members, businesses, etc. And they were able to arrive at consensus recommendations in June of 2021 on what we refer to as the 11 strategies. And those 11 strategies help form the land use proposal that I'll be discussing today. There was some early implementation of those strategies related to workforce training, green infrastructure funds in the Duwamish Valley, and launching of an environmental impact statement on proposed land use changes. Next slide, please. So these are the 11 strategies, their titles. You can read the report. They were approved with 85% consensus, and the 5 in the middle pertain to land use. And they, as I mentioned, form the basis of some proposed land use changes that we're looking at. I'll walk you through those in the next series of slides. Next slide, please. So essentially what the city is proposing are 3 new land use concepts that would become new zones for the city's industrial areas. You can see the title of these 3. They would be described in the city's comprehensive plan, and the zoning code would be changed to establish these new zones and essentially replace the existing industrial zones. In the next 3 slides, I'll quickly walk through what each of these land use concepts is. Next slide, please. So the first is titled the Maritime Manufacturing and Logistics Zone. And this zone would essentially strengthen protections for core and legacy industrial uses in places that are close to rail, close to ports, close to waterways. One of the main features is to prevent encroachment of incompatible development like box retail stores or mini storage that we've seen as an unintended type of development in some industrial areas. Next slide, please. So while we strengthen protections in core areas, this concept, the industry and innovation concept, is an idea for transit-oriented development that can be compatible with places close to light rail stations or other transit. So we're looking at this, generally speaking, within a half mile of light rail. And the idea is to encourage dense employment that could have a mix of bona fide light industrial space at the first or second level of a building, and then encourage multiple stories of research, tech, office that you currently can't do today in an industrial zone. And the idea is to encourage an employment-based transit-oriented development model in places in industrial areas. So some innovative mixing of uses that we haven't seen that much in Seattle to date. Next slide, please. And third and final concept is what's titled the Urban Industrial Zone concept. This is envisioned to improve livability at the edges of the city's industrial areas. So near urban villages, places like Ballard, for example. And the idea is to change zoning to do more to encourage a variety of small shops, makers, arts, and light industry space, improve vegetation, landscaping, tree planting, have good walkability, etc., and really be complementary to residential areas at the edges of our industrial area where they do abut urban villages. There could be some potential for limited new housing in this concept. So we're studying a range of that. Next slide, please. So the city is in the middle of an environmental impact statement looking at this land use proposal. This is a different EIS than the Sound Transit's EIS, but we believe they're coordinated. This is the timeline. The draft EIS comment period just closed in March. However, we're doing some additional engagement with Georgetown and South Park. We expect a final EIS this summer, and that could potentially queue up land use changes late this year or early next year. Next slide, please. I'm going to show you just 2 quick maps. This is the existing zoning, and you're focused on the Ballard Interbay area today. 90% is in an industrial general zone today, which is a protective zone. We also have an industrial commercial and industrial buffer zone. Today, no new residential uses are permitted in industrial zones. And next slide, please. I'm just showing you the 4th alternative, which is the greatest degree of change. But the land use alternatives we're studying apply different combinations and geographies of those new zone concepts that I walked you through. So in this map, you can see the purple color extending along the Elliott Avenue corridor in the Smith Cove vicinity. And you can also see that purple in Ballard along the 14th Avenue corridor near the proposed station. And you can see some urban industrial proposed in places north of Leary Way in Ballard, near the Ballard Urban Village. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, a couple of points that may be worth considering in your review. The Maritime Industrial Advisory Group discussed how to minimize adverse impacts on the function of the manufacturing industrial centers. That included what you heard earlier about avoiding impacts to maritime activities in Salmon Bay. That was very important to the group. This work explores the potential for an employment-dense, transit-oriented development model appropriate for maritime or for manufacturing industrial centers. The healthy edge areas that I spoke about. The recommendations also specifically spoke to the Interbay Armory site, which is a large site that could be reused in the future, called for site-specific master planning of that property when it can be reused. And lastly, I'll just note that our environmental impact statement, the draft environmental impact statement, did find that there really would be a need for multimodal improvements near the station areas in the manufacturing industrial centers, because there's a real lack of sidewalk and bicycle infrastructure and safety conflicts. So our EIS amplified the need for those corresponding investments. With that, I'll conclude. Thanks for the chance to provide this context to you today.
Thank you. Michael, it doesn't seem we have any members of the public, or do we have members of the public?
Well, we do have two people
Okay.
that are on as attendees. I think they started with us when we kicked the meeting off. So if either the people who are attending, who are calling in, if you want to provide public comment, go ahead and use the hand raising function. We allow up to 2 minutes of public comment. We'll also watch this to see if anyone raises their hand. Actually, we have one person who wants to provide comment, Lei Wu. I will go ahead and unmute for a 2-minute time period. And
actually a city staff with SDOT. Thank you.
Excuse me?
She's Lei Wu is with SDOT, she said.
Oh, I see. So provide comment today, or are you just attending?
No, I am as a working member on the team.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Did you want to say anything?
No.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
We'll go ahead and check back after commissioners have an opportunity to ask questions. We have, I think, this segment till about 10:05. Is that correct, Valerie?
Her agenda has us until 10.
Okay.
So commissioners, I guess, try and be succinct in your time. And we start off with Elaine, and please ask questions, but also make comments. So we're combining our question and comment period.
And I just wanted to remind you too, the parts about the city plans, if you wanted to dig deeper on any of those, identify that. We don't need to spend a lot of time providing comments on those. We could do that at another time too.
So just for clarification, Vanita, we're really just asking questions about this first project orientation.
Yes, that's right. So there'll be 3 more parts to this morning's session. Next one's going to focus on guideway structures and bridges. Then we're going to dive into the Smith Cove station and then the Ballard station. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Great. Okay. My first question is sort of very, very high level, very general, but I was very curious in terms of preferred alternatives versus other alternatives. How often in the history of Sound Transit is an alternative selected that's not the preferred alternative?
So Elaine, I can maybe start. Oh, actually, maybe Emily. Emily, do you want to?
Oh, either way is fine. So actually, I think that this is the first capital project, the major capital project like this, where we have had a preferred alternative going into the draft EIS. So we actually don't have precedent for changing for whether or not we change. Sloan, is that what you were going to say too?
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yes. Yeah.
And so what's differentiated this application to say, for instance, on the Ballard segment, like this is our preferred alternative?
Yeah, so that was as a part of ST3, Sound Transit made this larger effort to try to shorten project timelines. And so one of the elements of doing that was identifying preferred alternative earlier. But that did mean that we identified a preferred alternative with a lower level of analysis than we typically would have. And so that was, so going into the draft EIS is when those alternatives were given those different names, preferred with third-party funding, et cetera. Now we know more information. And so the information that we showed you today from the draft EIS is sort of new since those names were given. And that's why we've always said the board has the opportunity to confirm or modify that preferred alternative at their next milestone, which we're expecting to be this summer. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, no. And I guess I'm just kind of curious because it does seem right, like there's an additional level of analysis that's been performed, but when there's something out in the public realm that's suggesting that one is preferred over the other, I'm just curious how that will sway public input, public comment, and the ability to elevate potentially some of the other alternatives that are on the table. So I don't think we probably have an answer for that today, but I'm also personally sort of wondering, like, how hard do we need to potentially champion comments if we feel strongly that the preferred alternative may not sort of rise to the top. So food for thought, I think, as we move forward. I think there was kind of a lot to take in there in the beginning. I think my other more general question, and I think we'll probably get into this more as we dive into various portions of the project, would be how you're looking at this massive infrastructure project that's very long route. And how is Sound Transit sort of considering some of these alternatives? I guess there's just a lot of diversity in this alignment between downtown and getting to Ballard, which is apparent in the analysis done on the, industrial areas, we're impacting residential. There are a number of historic structures that will be involved in this. And, at sort of this top level, it just sort of seems like we're looking generically at this very large infrastructure project. And I guess I'll be curious to see how we're treating sort of the entire alignment and being really sensitive to the context around it as it winds through the city. That's not really a question. I think it's just sort of a comment and wanting to discuss that more as we move forward. So thank you. And I'm not sure who I'm passing it on to.
Matt is next. I put the order in the chat, so hopefully you can all
see that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. This is really good information being presented. I am new to the commission, so I don't have a lot to ask at the moment, but I guess the one thing that stood out to me that's of interest is on the crossing of the Salmon Bay, that the tunnel options, or at least one tunnel option, appears to be cost commensurate with the elevated options. And that seems to be really significant because of the significantly lower impacts to all the issues that you raised potentially for a tunnel option. So I'm interested to learn more about that as we go further.
Thanks. I can talk about that a little bit if it's helpful. Yeah. So what we saw, so going into the draft EIS, we were seeing a pretty substantial cost difference between the tunnel and elevated alternatives, and so that's why those tunnel alternatives got that with third-party funding tag in their names. And so what we found, I'll just briefly say, is that so both construction and right-of-way costs in our estimates have gone up, but right-of-way costs have really started contributing a bigger, I guess, chunk to that. And sort of, I think the right-of-way is what's kind of more helping to close that gap between those two different cost estimates. And so because it has lower displacements, we're buying less, buying less land to build it, and then seeing that in terms of the results of the right-of-way costs. So just to touch on that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So that's really helpful. It does seem, in the material you presented, that the significantly less impacts on businesses, properties, jobs, housing. Really, that really stood out to me. That there may be a real option here.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, Elizabeth.
Thank you for all that material to think about. I am curious about, I think this is a question for Emily. It seems, as I'm listening to the effects of the various alternatives, it seems to me that in-water effects they rose to the top of my mind in terms of importance because of where we are in terms of salmon and environmental impacts. It seems like that's an enormous, it literally, I don't want to make a pun. It came to the top, floated to the top. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little more about how some of these things will be weighted going forward, some of these impacts in decision-making.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, there's no weighting per se of the different effects that are disclosed in the draft EIS. So I think it's really we're going to lean heavily on our agency partners, on community. We have community advisory groups. We've done lots of engagement, or will continue to do lots of engagement. So I think it's really including government to government tribal engagement. So it's really on the folks who are going to give us their comments to sort of help the board, I think, sort through what the community and our agency partners' priorities are for those. But that is certainly one that is important. The in-water effects. I think a lot of people are paying attention to that for sure. So sorry, I know that doesn't really answer the question, but yeah, no priorities in terms of like going in. Everything's sort of out there for everyone to consider and tell us what the priorities should be.
And that leads right into another question I have. So I'll stick with you, Emily, if you don't mind. What can you give a little more detail on, in particular, what the community involvement is right now relative to the DEIS, and then going forward, with as much detail as you can give without, driving yourself crazy right this minute, or
Sure. So are you interested in what we're doing or what we're hearing?
A little bit of both.
Okay. So I will do my best. This would be better answered by Lita or a community engagement specialist. But and Sloan went over this a little bit at the beginning, but we have, so we kicked off our formal public comment period on January 28th. We did a mailer to about 130,000 addresses to let people know, and those were all, kind of within the corridor, to let people know that this was starting, that there was information available for them to, find. We also did letters to potentially affected property owners. We actually did that right before the draft EIS came out. Letting them know that they were potentially affected and inviting them. We've been hosting property owner webinars throughout, actually before the draft EIS started, and that now we're continuing to hold those, I think weekly, if not a couple times a week, depending on the demand for those. We have been doing flyering. We've been out like with businesses. We've been doing email campaign, like we have an email campaign. We have social media going out. We have these community advisory groups, so that's a big piece of it. They are by geography. So we have one for Interbay Ballard, one for downtown, one for Soto CID, and one for West Seattle and Duwamish. So those groups meet monthly. They're I think about 15 to 20 members of the community each group, and so we've been going over the results from the DEIS with those groups, and getting, they're kind of, I think, starting to coalesce around some feedback for us. Let's see. We also have been working with the city, the city's community liaison program. So we have community liaisons out, who are members of the community, who are out discussing the project and getting folks involved. So I'm probably leaving something. Oh, and our meetings. We have a public meeting today, actually. So our first in-person open house is today here at Union Station in the plaza. So that's going to be going on for several hours in the rest of the day. And then we have had virtual public hearings. So the first one was on Tuesday. Those are also geographically based. So the Interbay Ballard one was on Tuesday, and then we have more next week for the other geographies. Sloan, I feel like that was most of what we've done. Can you think of anything I left out?
You've covered it. Yeah, we did some engagement early, like as we were starting the draft EIS, so transitioning from alternatives development. And of course, there's a lot of engagement in alternatives development, which sort of is what yielded the alternatives that we studied. So yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you for yet again.
We're really busy. We've been really busy talking to a lot of people. It's been great, though. We've been getting great input. Oh, and sorry, in terms of what we've been hearing, I can only really speak to what we've been hearing on Interbay Ballard, but some of the things that you all have brought up today are very consistent with what we've been hearing. So,
yeah, I would just remind everyone we're pretty tight on time today for each of these comment periods. So, yeah.
I'll say one more thing really fast. I think, and this is for the city, I'm hoping that artist live workspace will be in the mix when you're talking about zoning for this area, because it's definitely in the maritime industrial kind of shed. And I hope that could expand rather than contract. And I will pass this on to Erica, I believe, right?
Yes. Hi. Thanks, everyone. This was really great for my first foray into the Design Commission here. So thank you for having me. I am quite curious about how sort of analysis of the alternatives has taken into account what we've learned from the development of the light rail thus far. We have elevated tracks, and I'm really curious what not only the displacement of the actual property values that would need to be purchased for the alignment, but what that impacts are to the adjacent properties, and whether there's loss of ongoing value of sort of the immediate proximity of those elevated tracks, how businesses have sort of engaged with that, what their challenges have been, what the community's sort of response has been. And so I know there's been extensive outreach in Ballard and in Interbay, but I would actually say that it would be very valuable to hear from the folks in the lower Duwamish Valley about what those impacts have been and how their response has been to a similar infrastructure project. So sort of also just what the impacts during construction were of those elevated situations, because I know that was really detrimental to some communities, and I wouldn't want to see us not take advantage of that knowledge as we look at these new portions of the city. So I'd be curious to learn about that and what information sort of came from our history with these projects. And then I guess I was in sort of similar mindset to, I believe it was Matt who brought it up, that, you know, it's looking like there's actually, I was really, it was a positive thing for me to hear that some of the tunnel options might not be out of the scope. I just think that from an urban design perspective, the impacts of those are so much lesser and really serve the community in a very different opportunistic way. So I'm excited to see that. I know we're kind of short for time, so I'll leave it there and pass it to Molly, but thank you guys.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, Erica, and thank you all for having me. It's been a great day to join all of you. So thank you both for your presentation. Thank you all for your presentations. Starting off, I just want to disclose my my work relationship with Sound Transit. So my firm works with Sound Transit on station environment, and some of those overlap with the West Seattle to Ballard extension. I have not been involved in that work, nor have I reviewed it. And I work with Sound Transit on TOD areas outside of this area. None of those have touched the West Seattle to Ballard link extension. And then, so jumping in, and Vanita, I'm going to kind of express these as questions/comments for speed. And if you want to dig into any of them now, just let me know. Otherwise, they could be answered throughout the rest of the presentation. So the first one is a question about displacement. So you shared, Emily, some of the displacement for each of the stations. And so my question is really whether there's any anti-displacement policy that's being considered for those areas. And I'm also interested to know from an equity perspective, how many of these are renters, how many of them are homeowners, and what the plans are for some of those properties, and how that's going into, as Elizabeth mentioned, kind of the weighting of the effects. I know you mentioned that at this point in time, there isn't a weighting of effects, but I would be curious to see that equity perspective in regard to displacements and in comparison of those different displacements, rather than solely the numbers of displacements, but also who's being displaced, how much are they at risk of being displaced from our region entirely, how much are these people who will likely move to somewhere else in their neighborhood. My next, I'd be interested just in clarity of the mix and match potential for each station location. So you touched on that a little bit, but even just as we look at each station, if you can be clear about this one could connect to this option, and this option, I think that would be really helpful to think through how we value each option. And then I just want to express support for Elizabeth's note about artist live work, for Erica's question about lessons learned from existing elevated tracks, and for the property values as well as community experience of the surrounding areas, and for Matt's note about the preferred tunnel option. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly. There was a lot of good content in there. I don't know if someone wanted to answer the first part of her questions.
I can maybe start. And
okay.
Yeah, and on the displacement question. So yeah, thank you for the questions and comments, Molly. It's good to see you. Sound Transit, for anyone, any business or resident who's directly affected by the project is entitled to relocation benefits under the Uniform Act, which is a federal requirement that Sound Transit follows. And that involves, both sort of consulting for identifying alternative, sites or places to move, as well as specifically for businesses, funds that, and those are unlimited, that's sort of first category. And then the second category are funds to essentially make tenant improvements or marketing updates, et cetera. Again, specific for businesses. For property owners, it's a little bit different because they maybe not only have a business or residence there, but they're also they own property in fee. So there's a different sort of process and set of expectations, requirements that goes into that that essentially involves fair market value compensation for the purchase of the property, as well as some of those relocation benefits as well. The EIS does identify high level categories of displacements, and it even identifies specific sites that would be part of the footprint of the project in the drawings, but it does not go into the level of detail maybe that you're asking for, which is getting into specific naming specific businesses, specific residences, for reasons of maintaining privacy. So part of what's unique about our approach with this project is that we are engaging with property owners and those affected by the project a lot earlier to help them understand what it means, and to get them acquainted to the range of benefits that Sound Transit provides as compensation. And Emily, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add to that, or if you were able to hunt down the citation in the EIS. But if not, we can get the citation to you.
Great, thank you so much.
Thanks, and I'll just close this session with comments. I would reiterate what Matt already brought up at the beginning, that when looking at the summary, it seemed really obvious that the 14th Avenue Tunnel is a really good alternative, and thank you for the background on how you got there and not knowing all the factors early on, but any alternative that is less impactful from an environmental point of view, but also from a human point of view, just seems like it should rise to the top. So I hope that is something that's being very strongly considered at this point. I don't have additional comments to add. I really appreciate the sharing of the new industrial zoning. It's very interesting to see that, and glad to see the compatibility and thinking how it integrates with the Sound Transit work that's happening, and also the potential expansion of the Ballard Urban Village and how that relates as well to this stationary area planning. So I think we can move on to the guideway structures and bridges portion of the presentation.
Great, thanks Vanita, and thanks Commissioner. So I'll start resharing screen again. Everything good? Looks like it's good, okay. I'm gonna introduce Dirk Baker, who's our corridor design manager, and he's gonna walk through this section of the presentation. Dirk, take it away.
Thank you, Sloan. Well, next slide, I would say. Interbay Station to Ballard Station is approximately 2 miles, and it's all structure in this presentation. Next slide. From Dravis, and this is where we're starting this presentation. This is Dravis and 15. From Dravis to Ballard and Market is approximately 2 miles. And as I said, it's all structure from Dravis to Ballard and Market in this presentation. And this is the area of Interbay Station. And, we're going through the structures and we can show you a little bit on how things are placed and how we're trying to avoid infrastructure and other items along the alignment. So here you can see our station location. You can see some of our track work there in plan view, and elevation. You can see in this particular case, our typical guide. Next slide. Here you can see the environment changes a little bit. We have to cross over Elliott Avenue and the Nickerson-Emerson ramps, which is, again, a challenge. And you can see that in this particular case, when you look at the plan view, our span lengths are increasing. This is primarily to miss those items that are on the ground or below ground. In this area, we'll also take into account any future work that the city of Seattle is planning or may be planning with regards to the Ballard Bridge replacement. It was mentioned earlier by Vera. But you can see there's a lot on the ground. The foundations are getting bigger, but we're placing them strategically to miss all of this infrastructure. Next slide. Here is one of the controlling factors on the alignment. This is the water crossing. One of the major constraints here is the vertical clearance over the water, as well as horizontally the waterway itself. Typical segmental box structure, but the lengths here have increased. The span lengths have increased to 450, I believe, so substantially longer. This is an area of a very vital waterfront and as well as shoreline access. You can see that on 14th Avenue, there's shoreline access. So the placement of the columns is very critical and very difficult. Next slide. And here we're moving into the 14th Avenue corridor, the 14th Avenue area. And what we're showing there is the station at Market. And again, you can see we have what we call a center platform station. And you can see the guideway is going to go to single twins. And there is some deployment of straddle bands. But these are, it's 2,000 feet long, and it's truly 4 different environments that we're trying to place the structure. Next slide. So here's some of the design fundamentals that we have to keep in mind. So obviously the alignment and the profile is the very first thing we look at, and that has to follow certain requirements. But then when we're looking at the placement of the columns and the span lengths, obviously the effects on the infrastructure, major utilities, and there are major utilities almost everywhere on this alignment, as well as the ECAs, that's in this particular case, the shoreline zone. So we really have to minimize the effects on that. That's a major component. Structurally, when we do look at those span lengths, we want to make sure we keep the span lengths within the optimal range for the structural performance. And we don't want to have bridge types that are totally unfamiliar for Sound Transit. Geotechnically, the foundation types and ground improvement methods play a really big role in this design. The soils that we travel through, there's a lot of fill on this alignment and also in this area. And so ground improvement is a major issue when we're looking at the design. And then finally, rail structure interaction, span length is very important for performance, for track performance. And we like to minimize special track work, especially expansion joints, which we would need the longer and lighter we make the spans. So it's really something that constrains us. Next slide. Just a summary of what we've done so far for the DEIS. And just to give you a sense, I mentioned it's about 2 miles, and here's sort of a small table that shows how we divvied up the span lengths along these 2 miles. And you can see at the bottom, we already have quite a bit of 50% more than 50% of long and very long spans to put the structure in. Next slide. Here's a little bit of a table that gives you some sense of the length and how it's related to the depth and the width of the structure. And so if we want to look at the long span and the very long span on this table, you can see that, you know, when you look at the span from midspan to the depth of that span at the pier, you know, that varies considerably, and it's somewhere from 10 feet in the center of a span to 22 feet at the column of a span. This is on our typical segmental construction. But then when you make that span longer, you know, longer than 250 or so, you can see how things can increase in bulk. So this table gives you some sense of that. Obviously, once you refine the design, these numbers would change, but this will help you get a sense of the bulk of these spans. Next slide. Here's a table. I think it's also good information. It gives you a sense of how high this structure is. So when we were at Interbay Station, I think we're clearing Dravis there, and obviously we have to be 20 feet above Dravis, so it puts us more or less in the 40 feet range. But then traveling to the Salmon Bay water crossing, we have to go up as high as 155 feet plus or minus, and then we go back down to Ballard Station. But it gives you a sense of the height of this structure. Again, it'll vary, but this gives you a sense of it. Next slide. Here are some of the typical dual track spans that we have in our system. These are pictures from different places in our system. On the left, we have our pre-stressed eye girders. Those would be used for spans up to 170, 180. Similarly, you can have a tub girder, which is on the top right there. And you can have a post-tension box girder, which is on the bottom there. So there's different ways of spanning 170 to 200 feet. And we do that regularly in the system. Next slide. Here is what we call a twin single track guideway span. This is what you would see near Interbay Station or near Ballard Station, where we have to approach a station, and the station has a center platform. So you can see on the left, we would have eye girders, 2 eye girders to carry the track, and on the right side, we have the tub girders. So 2 different solutions. Next slide. Here is the segmental box girder. We showed you the table. We have quite a bit of long span, so longer than 200 feet, and we would need to use this type of girder, this type of span. And so this picture shows what we've done in the Duwamish Valley. This is a crossing over I-5. And on the right is another example of such a long span girder on a curve. Next slide. So next couple of slides are going to be about the Salmon Bay crossing and some of the concepts that we've reviewed up to this point to inform the DIS and our work. So next slide. The first here is what we call our segmental box girder bridge concept. That's our baseline, and we talked about it a little bit here. The span lengths are approximately 450 feet. The bridge is well balanced over the navigation channel. But as you can see, we still have columns in the water, and we have columns on within the maritime properties. Next slide. Here's an example of a network arch bridge. The span lengths are not necessarily much longer than what I just showed you on our typical segmental box. but it's a different solution. So you have a little bit more flexibility with spacing, but as you can see here, as far as the columns are concerned, they fall pretty much in the same location as in our baseline segmental box girder. Next slide. Here is what we call an extra dose bridge. This, again, not much different than the segmental box girder in terms of column placements. The bridge will, the span will become lighter, not as boxy. Part of that is the reason for that is that we have now a lot of cables, little cable towers and cables that would allow a lot of the load to be carried in that manner, and making the span itself lighter. But in terms of span length, you could do more with this type of bridge, but as you can see, it's not just the span length in the Salmon Bay crossing. It's also trying to place columns in such a way that they don't have effect on the shoreline. There is shoreline access on 14th Avenue, so we need to keep that in mind. And then there's maritime properties on the south side of the bay, and so you want to make sure you place those columns there and have as little effect as possible. So it's a real puzzle to serve all those goals and to make sure you find the right solution. Next slide. This slide shows the cable stay bridge concept. This bridge can span more, longer span, I think optimal span somewhere in the range of 1,100 feet. The foundations get bigger, and clearly you can see here that we still do not get ourselves out of the water. So the bridge itself gets bigger, the towers get bigger, and as you can see on 14th Avenue, the tower on 14th Avenue takes up quite a bit on the shoreline there. Next slide. This is the movable span bridge on 15th Avenue alignment. Emily went through all of the alignments. There is an alignment on 15 that comes from 15th Avenue and then moves over on this side of the Ballard Bridge. This particular alignment has a movable long span, and the concept that is shown is a vertical lift bridge. So the span would lift up to a vertical clearance of 136 currently. Next slide. So some design features, some concepts. I'm going to show those now in the next number of slides. So talk a little bit, and I'll have some pictures to go with this, but obviously the column proportion is very important when you place yourself in the environments that we have here. There's different things we can do, things like plumb versus tapering. We can have a single mast. We can have double blades. I already showed some of those in the water crossings. We have single columns and straddle bends. And then there's things like diamond-shaped columns, H shapes, or A-shaped towers on the larger crossings. We're going to show a little bit about constant depth versus haunch depth, chord versus smooth curve for horizontal curvature. There's other things like above deck versus under deck for truss and arch bridges. We haven't really shown these here, but that comes into play at the Duwamish a little bit. And you can have single cable planes versus double cable planes if we are looking at extra dose or cable stayed bridges. So there's quite a few things that if we were to move into the preliminary engineering, that, when we do some more design exploration, these are things we could look at. Next slide. Here is a little bit of a visualization of that. On the top is our constant girder depth, and those are some of those eye girders or tub girders that we showed you earlier. We can have bunch girders, and at the bottom there, there's a bit of a combination between those two. These are elevation views. Depending a little bit on the spans, these are types of girders that we can work with. Next slide. Here are some of the column proportions that we talked about. There's the typical plumb, there's the tapered. You can have a single mast or you can have a double bladed mast. So those are things that we can consider, when we're looking at designing this structure. Next slide. Here's more for the bigger crossings. Diamond Tower has 2 cable planes, the H Tower with 2 cable planes, and then the A Tower. So these are examples under consideration if we were to build these structures. Next slide. Here's corded or smooth girders. We have some horizontal curvature on this particular segment, so there's different ways of doing that. It can be a smooth girder, as you see on the right, and it can be a corded girder, as you see on the left, shorter spans, but it can be balanced. Next slide. A little bit about materials. Sound Transit has currently we have no steel plate or steel box girders in our system. But we keep this option open for specific situations if it is a possibility. But currently we don't have that. These are examples from different cities. Next slide. We'll show you some architectural details that we've used in other locations for Sound Transit. Next slide. Here are some aesthetic enhancements, both with color or rustication. On the left is a long span bridge. I think this one is over I-405 in Bellevue. It has a specific color. There's rustication on the columns. On the right, there's an example of a straddle bend to stay out of the roadway. And again, it has been aesthetically enhanced. So those are some of the things we can talk about. Next slide. Here is an example of our decorative railing that's used in certain locations. On the right is that picture of that span over I-405. You can see it has very nice railing. Wall screenings for sound walls, if a sound wall is necessary in some locations. There's ways to enhance those. Next slide. And here's an example of artwork. Painting or some other attachments. I mean, these are just examples. But the idea is that if there's spaces under the guideway, and these are very big structures here, we're not as wide as these structures that are shown here, but there is a possibility to enhance any spaces like that. Next slide. Yeah. Before we go in Q&A, constructability. Both constructability, the soils are not very conducive to making it easy for the structures. Very poor soil conditions on large portions of the project. So that is really a consideration. Duration of construction and access of equipment to install the structures is also a consideration in choosing the right solution. That's probably the last slide, right?
That is. Thanks, Dirk.
Great, thank you. It looks like we don't have any members of the public, so we should just go ahead into commissioner comments and questions, same order. Elaine starting.
Great. Thank you for that really comprehensive overview. I feel like you presented this workbook of all the work that goes into evaluation and all the options that are out there to look at. And, you know, one of my overriding questions as you were going through your presentation did have to do with whether or not there would ever could be a steel option. So I think you did address that. I think what I am curious about a little bit is how a steel solution changes some of the constraints or opportunities regarding, you know, long spans and support and things like that. Because I think generally, you know, my interest in steel has to do with the potential to sort of downsize some of the bridge elements or be able to maybe provide a more refined solution in certain situations. But you don't need to answer that today. But it would be interesting to know. Maybe we can kind of come back to that at the end, and I'll just sort of go through my comments. I think that for me, this discussion really, I think about, you know, refinement of the guideway elements, I think is going to be key. And I think what you were showing is that there's a lot of opportunities for us to work together to come up with what are those correct refinements, and they might be different for different locations within the city. So I think that's something that we'll want to really focus on in the future. I think scale obviously is going to be key, you know, really looking to minimize scale where we think that it would be most impactful, like potentially, you know, lower rise residential neighborhoods versus industrial zones. So I think that there's probably going to be an appropriate level of refinement for different areas. And I think that's something that we really just need to pay attention to instead of sort of providing a, you know, one size all solution for the entire alignment. In terms of the bridge opportunities, you know, I think that there's, you know, I've got some strong concerns over just the, you know, there's so many constraints over that crossing over the ship canal. And, you know, the vertical constraint being, you know, one of the primary challenges in that there, you know, it's just towering over other historic bridges, you know, that we consider landmarks in our region. And not only having, you know, visual impact to that, having visual impact to natural land use features, you know, our mountains to the east, to the west. So I think that those are some serious challenges. The other thing I was thinking about in this discussion was, you know, in Portland, they have Tillicum Crossing, and that's a transit bridge. Obviously, it's got more functionality. I think it's got pedestrian crossing. But in a city of bridges that are all different and all historic, it kind of becomes a bridge in its own right. And I think that it's been really celebrated by the public and the people in the city. And so I think if we end up that we need to have a bridge, I guess I would like to say, like, this needs to become a bridge in its own right and not just sort of a, oh, we have to have it and it has to be this high in the air. We're not trying to spend a bunch of money on it, but like it's going to have to like really rise above and become something special. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. The other thing I would like to impress is that, you know, we've been talking about sustainability, opportunities with sustainability, embodied carbon impacts moving forward. And with all of this guideway construction being primarily concrete, there are major advances that are being made in the industry to lower the embodied concrete of carbon. And I would really love to see Sound Transit really starting to rally around some metrics and make some commitments to embodied carbon reduction moving forward on these projects. And I think that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you.
And, hi, Benita. This is Michael. I think Matt had to drop off for a little bit. I don't see that he's returned, but if we see him before the end of this section, we'll loop back.
I think I'm next, correct? Yes. Thank you. I love engineering. I love seeing all these bridge, how they work and what the challenges are, and they really are multiple. One of the things I'm going to piggyback a little bit onto what Elaine just said about concrete. I think bridges have an opportunity, transit, especially light rail. It's called light rail, and it's a wonderful term. I think the possibility for aerial guideways in the light rail realm to be light, both in in structure and in appearance. I think that helps distinguish them from freeways. So in addition to some of the environmental concerns about concrete, I'm hoping that there's, as you go forward and looking at the details of this, Dirk, it's that's considered. There's an opportunity for something that is really dramatic and also as light as possible on the land. And I know that's you've already addressed that, and I appreciate that. I support that. For me, I'm a sculptor, and so bridges are fascinating because they are sculpture. And I hope that especially in these maritime industrial areas, that there's some kind of connection back, no matter where the aerial guideway occurs, whether it's over water or not, there's some connection to that kind of activity that occurs in a maritime industrial area. That's where the context for an overwater crossing is all the other bridges too, and how they've been built in the past, not to replicate that, but to somehow have its own presence in that lexicon of bridges. From my perspective, I think it's a really exciting opportunity. I did work on Portland on the Orange Line, and so I immediately thought of the image that you showed. And I think what's interesting about that is you showed it apparently under construction, correct? And so that how that looks under construction is really terrific. I'm wondering if some of that can still exist out in the landscape, because that's the structure of how a bridge works, rather than hiding infrastructure. I think there's an opportunity to celebrate how difficult and how gorgeous that can be. So I'm glad you're looking at other examples. Maybe there's some internationally as well, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, to take a look at more broadly at how these kinds of solutions have gone forward. And I think that's close to, the other thing, you also showed some artwork that exists in a way to mitigate how one feels underneath a bridge structure. And so I think that as an artist, I think that should be the last resort. I'm hoping that walking under an aerial guideway, driving under an aerial guideway, being on transit on top of an aerial guideway, I'm hoping that structure can show strongly enough and interestingly enough that there will not need to be mitigation after the fact, and the artist can go do something else. There are a lot of other opportunities, I think, with sound.
Yeah, no, I do agree, and there's other opportunities for art. It was just an example.
Yeah. No, they're good examples too, and we have some great examples of what's happened under the freeway in Seattle as well. So I think again that could still happen, but I'm hoping the guideways themselves will be gorgeous, intriguing, and light on the land in their own right, to the extent possible. So I think that's it, and I'm passing this on to Erica.
Elaine, did you have your hand up for? Yeah,
I did. And I wasn't sure if this was the right time to say it, but after all this bridge discussion, I just wanted to go on the record saying that I think that, my preference would be for an underground station in Ballard. I just wanted to say that explicitly. I'm just saying, if we need a bridge, it should be fantastic. But it's just sort of commentary in terms of, the bridge, guideways in general. So thank you.
go ahead, Erica.
Thanks. I want to echo both Elaine and Elizabeth's comments. I think they were both absolutely on point. And thank you. I feel like I got a little education in structural bridge infrastructure, which was wonderful. I'm an urban designer, so what I'm always thinking about is the experience of a person on the ground next to these structures. And so when I think about the structures like this that I know, they're, as you showed, over large, infrastructure as it is. They're crossing I-5. They're going next to big roadways. And when I think about this space, we have a very finite integration of small scale pedestrian environments. And so our relationship to these structures are going to be very, very different than that when you're driving down I-5. And so I guess I would both say that I agree with Elaine that I think I would much prefer we not have to have a bridge. But if we are, that we really think about the visibility and what it means to interface it almost every single intersection with these pillars, because the visibility and the safety issues that come from such a monolithic structure being placed in an environment that's already quite complicated with many pedestrians and bicycles and freight and car movement, that is a bit of a visibility nightmare. And I think when we're thinking about it at a large scale, we're really not thinking about what complications come from that impact on the ground. And then another thing that came up when we were looking at the location of the pillars is the public access point you mentioned on 14th. If I think about other sites like this, like the bridge over Lake Washington, the I-90 bridge, we have a public access point at that point. And often that's what happens, is public access to our waterways are adjacent to infrastructure that in some way sort of ruins that public access point. They become dark and shaded and somewhat unenjoyable for the public. And so if we do have to have these structures and they are impacting the key access points to our waterways, I would really hope that Sound Transit is able to provide an equal exchange of public access to the water at another location that isn't impacted to the same degree that that location would be. I also, again, wanted to echo some of the mentions about the steel options. I think if we do are required to have a bridge, that integrating the sort of visible aesthetic of this very large structure with that of our internationally renowned maritime district is so critical, that this really embeds itself aesthetically into its surrounding community, and people can celebrate it and be excited about it as its own entity, and not as something that we're trying to sort of hide, which I think is not going to happen when you have a structure of this scale. And then, of course, I'm just curious overall about some of the possible implications environmentally of this structure, whether there are vibrations that are going to impact, the fisheries and the environmental systems that are at play in those waterways, if there are particulates that could come from the tracks. These are things I just don't have a lot of information about that I would love to hear more about as we move forward. And thank you again. And with that, I'll pass it on to Molly.
Great. Thank you, Erica. And thank you, Dirk. We really appreciate you bringing us into the big aesthetic moves early in case the bridge option is chosen. And I will echo Elaine and others that an underground option, a tunnel option would be our preference. But that if a bridge option is chosen, being brought in this comprehensive way early is greatly appreciated. I really appreciated your single views of each of a variety of options that you've been studying for our high level understanding. If we do continue down the road with a bridge option, I'd be interested in seeing each of them with key views as well as compared to other bridges in the area, so we can really look at how it does fit into the broader history of our bridges in the region. I will also echo that it would, based on its scale, really truly need to be a landmark if a bridge were included. And so really the aesthetics of that would have to be a celebratory thing within our skyline. I'll also say that, so Erica mentioned concerns about the columns, safety and lighting under where these touch down. I would be interested in particular sensitivity to talking about areas like the Burke-Gilman, areas that are major pedestrian or bike or occupiable public areas that are immediately under. And so for any of the options, knowing how they differ in their treatment of those areas would be incredibly helpful. Also, I'd be interested in hearing about thoughts about how the bridges are meeting the land and public spaces that would remain, as well as Erica mentioned, how other public spaces might be enhanced elsewhere in areas that public spaces will be impacted. I'd also be curious about what water handling and water management looks like as that water comes off of the bridge, and if there are opportunities for visible water treatment that's visible to the public. And then I also want to just bring into the room a conversation that happened prior. Dirk, you mentioned the overlap between looking at this bridge and looking at the Ballard Bridge from a city perspective. So I just wanted to go back to a comment from 2019 from this group. So that was that any bridge type in any location should provide multimodal transit and non-motorized facilities. And then they said that the city should partner with Sound Transit in fully examining this idea. The other comment was to maximize efficiency, control construction costs, and reduce neighborhood impacts. Sound Transit in the city should explore the idea of replacing the Ballard Bridge with a new bridge that provides room for transit, auto, and non-motorized use. And I'm curious if, as the draft EIS came into being, if any further conversations about those ideas emerged between Sound Transit and the city.
On that last point, I let Emily noodle on that for a little bit. I wanted to go back just to give a little bit more context. When we developed these concepts, we didn't do it in a vacuum. We did work with the city very intensively on the 14th Avenue side as an example of what would happen under the bridge there in terms of, different cross sections and how the columns would affect cross section, and water treatment was part of that, Molly. On the water side, for the replacement of the water ramp and the sewer line, we work closely with the city to find an alternative location nearby that would, provide continuous access. And then there's opportunities to make that shoreline, enhance that shoreline once the project is built. And so those things, those conversations are happening as part of the process. And then in the DEIS, we have addressed things like environmental, water quality during construction, tribal issues with fishing and those fish windows. And so there a lot of things have gone into developing these concepts that take into account many of the concerns you just expressed. So, that is visible in the DEIS, and I encourage you to take a look at that. Emily, could you address that issue of multimodal? I think that's a little bit in the past. I can't recall all the details.
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of combining with a potential Ballard Bridge replacement, as Dirk mentioned, we have been in continuous conversation with SDOT and the city on and have participated in, as a I don't know, advisory group member or something, in different groups, both on the Ballard Interbay Regional Transportation Study and the Ballard Bridge and the Magnolia Bridge studies. But at this time, because the city doesn't have funding or a real solid timeline for replacement of those bridges, we're on our timeline. We are moving forward with just the light rail bridge at this time, but definitely appreciate that comment and desire to look for solutions that maximize efficiencies and accommodate all users. So thanks for that.
Great, thank you so much. And then just to wrap up, I've also just wanted to support the ideas on embodied carbon, seeing some metrics and commitments and interest in concrete mixes that reduce the greenhouse gas equivalents would be exciting to see. And I'll pass it to you, Vanita.
Great, thank you. There's been some really good comments, so I don't have anything new to add, but I will just briefly summarize some of the high level things. In general, you're hearing from us appreciation for the tunnel option, but if the bridge for some reason is the one that moves forward, that this really has to be a really elegant piece of engineering. It's going to be so prominent that it needs to have special strength, both the views from distance, but then that experience up close and what's happening at the ground level are all super important, as you've already really mentioned. I would say too, we've highlighted that we're not looking for later decorative elements to improve guideways and structures, that really the form itself needs to stand on its own as a strong, piece of architecture and engineering, and without relying on an artist to fix it later. And that there might not be there's probably also not a one-size-fits-all approach to the guideways through this segment because of the variety of contexts we're moving through. So thinking very specific to the adjacent context and the changing land use is something we encourage Sound Transit to take very seriously. So and then sustainability, we know how much concrete goes into building this line, and so it's a great opportunity to be a leader in how concrete can be done with a reduction of embodied carbon. So, thank you.
Benita and commissioners, the only thing I would add on to the larger discussion, and this is fantastic work, Valerie and Kate and I will continue to talk about what the role that the Design Commission played in analyzing bridge typologies in the 520 corridor and how that work, if a elevated structure is the potential outcome here at Salmon Bay, the role that the commission can assist in looking at evaluating and advancing bridge typologies that take into consider all the things that you've discussed today. So those discussions are ongoing, and we'll continue to work with Sound Transit on that kind of outcome. So I will mute and send it back to the presenters.
All right. Thank you. Let's see. I'm gonna back to Adobe. Great. So thanks for that presentation, Dirk, and for the questions and comments from the commission. We're now going to pivot into the two stations that we were asked to cover, starting with Smith Cove, and then we'll end with Ballard. We'll have Q&A for both at the end of both presentations. So we're going to start with Smith Cove Station. Emily walked through the alternatives that we're studying at Smith Cove earlier in terms of the alignment and the general station locations. But as you'll see, we're studying three station alternatives at Smith Cove. The preferred is an elevated station spanning the Gaylord flyover, so a little bit farther north. Then the other two station locations, which we're studying in an elevated and a retained cut configuration, closer to Prospect Street, which is essentially where the proposed ST3 representative alignment station location was. And that's right adjacent the Helix pedestrian bridge. The slide also covers the main outcomes pertaining to this particular station area coming from our joint racial equity toolkit work between Sound Transit and the city of Seattle. The sort of three main points, which are fairly similar for this and for a lot of the North End line stations, really pertain to making sure that the final location and design decisions support the enhancement of mobility and access to these high opportunity areas for communities of color and low income populations. And where we can, really focusing on creating opportunities for equitable development. And that sort of vector of what equitable development means is somewhat different depending on the station location. Here at Smith Cove, which is in the industrial zone, as Jeff mentioned in his presentation earlier, any opportunities for equitable development, Smith Cove and Interbay, would really be focusing more on employment, transit-oriented development. So really thinking about, how can those spaces include access to some of those high-paying jobs, or opportunities for enterprise development within walking distance of light rail stations or within an easy bus ride. And then, of course, the design value of creating a sense of belonging at stations for communities of color, particularly important as we're in these industrial areas. So really thinking through as we're progressing in the design development, since we're still at a fairly high level now, but really thinking about those site level and architectural design gestures that really sort of help to activate and foster a sense of belonging in place. So as we look at some of the context within the 10-minute walkshed of these stations, of course, there are several dominant features here, three. The Queen Anne hillside, which Emily mentioned earlier, being a major feature that some of these alternatives interact with in terms of the steep slopes and potentially the need to retain a portion of that slope. Then, of course, Elliott Avenue and the BNSF corridor, two major freight corridors that are really arteries for the BNMIC districts to the north and connecting it into the Duwamish and the other industrial areas south of downtown. So these are two critical corridors, but also barriers, potential barriers to access to the station. So that's really becomes a major theme of thinking through the station siting and design, and you'll see that in our stations focused information. It's also registered here in the walkshed. So you can see the walkshed isn't that sort of neat diamond shape that we might be accustomed to in flatter areas with a more regular and developed street grid. Here, that walkshed is really sort of constrained by those topographic variables of the Queen Anne hillside and the Elliott Avenue and BNSF corridors. Of course, we also have the waterfront nearby with several big things happening. The Expedia campus development in the former Amgen property, which would be sort of directly connected to those Prospect Street alternatives via the Helix Ped Bridge that was built by Amgen group when that campus was developed. Of course, the new Expedia Beach, which extends the waterfront from Myrtle Edwards Park, sort of a network of parks up to Smith Cove itself, and the Elliott Bay Trail is a major bike ped artery through, connecting downtown and the north side of the city. And then, of course, Terminal 91, which includes the cruise ship terminal, as well as just above this map, the Terminal 91 uplands, which is a site of a redevelopment project by the Port of Seattle. And then just to the north of the preferred alternative station as well is the Armory site. So a lot of constraints, but a lot of interesting destinations and opportunities happening in the vicinity, and a lot of thinking happening through the city's industrial lands effort. Nonetheless, given these constraints, given what we know right now, this would have a fairly low ridership in terms of daily boardings, owing to some of these constraints, and sort of the fact that you have large destinations, but perhaps not a diversity of destinations in quite the same way. And also, we anticipate that most folks will be accessing the station by on foot, walking. So really coming from Expedia and some of those big destinations nearby. So this slide summarizes, as we've covered in previous presentations, some of the key points of feedback that we've received in early engagement activities with communities and with neighborhoods in the vicinity of the stations. And this is really focusing on some of the things I've already covered in terms of a desire to really think about how the station location and the improvements serve to connect the neighborhoods, particularly Queen Anne, to the waterfront, really thinking about opportunities for improving the connections up the hillside into Queen Anne, particularly 10th Avenue West and Olympic Way, and potentially opportunities to also connect into the Kinnear Park circulation network. And then, of course, thinking about the station's access to some of these major potential redevelopment sites, the Interbay Armory site held by WSDOT, the state of Washington, and the Terminal 91 Uplands and Smith Cove Cruise Terminal held by the Port of Seattle. Of course, the bridge infrastructure in this area is a big concern too, with the Magnolia Bridge being a major feature and connecting point from the Magnolia neighborhood into the station, which we'll see as we walk through the transit integration slides. So these are some of the main points of feedback and desires that community have elevated in our engagement so far. So we're going to start with the preferred alternative, looking at the preferred alternative for Smith Cove Station. This is the elevated Gaylord Street Station. The platform would be, again, elevated. It's an elevated station. The platform would span the West Gaylord Street flyover with entrances on either side of the flyover at the Elliott Avenue grade, as well as the potential to tie in to the Gaylord flyover pedestrian path at the mezzanine level of this North Station entrance. Again, the adjacencies, the Southwest Queen Anne Greenbelt is just across Elliott Avenue, and the on-ramp, off-ramp complex between the Magnolia Bridge and the Gaylord Street overpass. It's quite close to the Terminal 91 entry, which is right you're sort of at the upper left part of the graphic. Also proximate to the Seattle Armory site, a fairly quick walking distance north to access the south end of the site. And it's also a little bit more distant from the Expedia entrance compared to the other alternatives that we'll be looking at shortly. As I mentioned, the station entrances on either side of Gaylord Street at the Elliott Avenue grade. You can see here the cross section on the left side of the slide shows that entrance oriented towards Elliott Avenue, as well as a mezzanine concourse level that would be essentially at the Gaylord Street overpass grade, with an opportunity to tie in at that mezzanine level to the Gaylord Street overpass, which, as I noted, is a main point of connection to the Elliott Bay Trail and to Expedia and Terminal 91. For the transit circulation scheme here, there are several important things to note with Smith Cove Station. One is that it is an important point of connection for Magnolia bus service, local bus service, and rapid ride service that essentially connects Magnolia to various other places in the future Metro Connects 2040 network. It's also a designated site for the terminus and layover of some regional routes that Metro operates and will sort of operate in the future that run from East King County and South King County through downtown. So this would be essentially the spot where they would be, they'd be running through those through the major employment centers downtown, and then stopping and laying over here before re-entering service. So this is a really important sort of administrative and operational function for Metro and the regional service routes, especially as those layover sites are shifted from existing locations in downtown and South Lake Union. So in all of these Smith Cove concepts, you'll see designated layover areas, and it's an important part of the program of the station here. So that results in a pattern of bus stops that are straddling Gaylord Street on both sides of Elliott Avenue. That's reflecting the fact that you have, as well as a couple of stops that are sort of within this transit center area. That's really reflecting the fact that you're having buses coming from multiple directions here, from the north down 15th Avenue west from Magnolia via the Magnolia Bridge, as well as from the south from downtown. And those are the sort of regional express buses that I was mentioning. So sort of a big hub of stops in multiple directions right in the vicinity of the station. This is showing the bicycle pedestrian connections through the station area. So as I mentioned, the direct connection to the Gaylord flyover provides a direct interface with the Elliott Bay Trail and walking and biking paths to the south, so towards downtown and Expedia, as well as to the north, such as Terminal 91 and Magnolia. We note here also a potential trail connection through the Armory property paralleling the guideway, which could provide either augmented access and capacity, or redundant capacity to the Elliott Bay Trail, or facilitate a shift in that trail's alignment to connect up with the Ship Canal Trail. We're also showing improvements to sidewalks and potentially new facilities that could be introduced on Elliott in tandem with the guideway. And then finally here, looking at the opportunities to enjoy places around the station. This particular location, really all the Smith Cove locations are quite constrained in terms of the requirements of the infrastructure, the adjacent natural features and barriers. And so this doesn't yield quite the same opportunities for transit-oriented development that we might see at other station locations and that we've reviewed so far in this series of meetings. And the geometries are quite constrained as well. So Smith Cove is one of the few station areas along this whole project where we really didn't identify a critical mass of redevelopment opportunities post-construction. So here the nature of the challenge really is to think creatively about the public space under the tracks, which could include either sort of a park or plaza programming function, or in the case of this alternative here in particular, given its proximity to these to this major infrastructural complex, are there other sort of smaller scale uses that could be programmed under the guideway, and potentially in this sort of area here, that might not be sort of what you typically think of as TOD, but maybe a smaller scale use that sort of helps to activate and hold that corner, particularly as the guideway transitions north of the Magnolia Bridge and into the Armory property. So that is something that we've identified as something to really think about further if this alternative moves forward. And then, of course, to the south of the station, as the guideway transitions across Elliott Avenue, thinking of a transit plaza and maybe other ancillary uses that might be able to be programmed into the station entrance facility, given the fact that it's both serving a lot of different bus routes, regional and local, as well as potentially pickup, drop-off, and other services oriented towards Terminal 91 cruise, the cruise terminal, or Expedia. So now we're going to look at the other draft EIS alternatives for Smith Cove Station. This is the elevated Prospect Street station, so SIB2, that's connecting to the Republican portal and the Republican alignment, preferred alternative alignment in the Seattle Center area. So as you can see here, we're a little bit farther to the south. So whereas with the preferred alternative, we're up at Gaylord Street, here we're a few blocks to the south, right sort of at Prospect Street, across Elliott Avenue from the Helix Bridge. This alternative is much closer to the Expedia campus, but it's also really sort of tucked up against the Southwest Queen Anne Greenbelt, and very close to Kinnear Park as well, noted here. Go to the next slide. The platform essentially would be just north of the Prospect Street right-of-way, essentially between Prospect and Lee Streets. And you can see here it's a center platform configuration. It would be about 35 feet from the platform down to grade. And you can see that in the cross section here at left. And there would be two station entrances, one located right at Prospect Street and one at the north end of the platform here. Also point out the layover feature, which would be right behind the station, essentially between the station and guideway and the Greenbelt. Relatively simple access configuration here. There's no need for a mezzanine because of the height of the station here. The transit integration scheme is a bit more consolidated compared to what we were looking at the preferred alternative at Gaylord. So really, northbound buses could really consolidate their stop zones on the east side of Elliott here. And there would be additional zone for through routes heading southbound, essentially from the Magnolia local service into downtown. And then another zone that would be for picking up passengers as buses are transitioning from layover and sort of getting back onto their southbound routes, heading to the east side of King County or South King County. Also noting here the pickup drop-off functions that could include shuttle services and then paratransit, which would be located adjacent to that south station entrance. Some of the walking, rolling, and biking considerations at the station. There would be a new signal and crossing, or I should say maybe a new crossing on the north side of Prospect Street and Elliott to really accommodate the additional pedestrian capacity that's envisioned to access the station. Because what we were looking at earlier with the height of the structure here, there isn't the same sort of opportunity to potentially extend the Helix Bridge across or elevated pedestrian infrastructure across Elliott Avenue, since there isn't a mezzanine structure to tie into. So this would require folks to come back down to grade, cross, and then rise back up to the station platform from grade. But it would also be quite close to that connection to the Elliott Bay Trail on the west side of the BNSF, and also noting the opportunity for improved sidewalks as well as improved facilities on Elliott, which could be particularly useful for connecting into the Roy Street Neighborhood Greenway and the bicycle facilities serving Queen Anne and Uptown neighborhoods. And similarly here, there isn't the same opportunity for, or there isn't an opportunity for transit-oriented development, just given the footprint of the infrastructure and the topographical landscape constraints here, but also noting the opportunity for creative uses under the tracks, potentially even tying into the Kinnear Park landscape and programming as we're moving through this section of the corridor. And then finally, the third alternative that we're looking at in Smith Cove, other draft EIS alternative, SIB 3 is a retained cut station at Prospect Street. This is connecting to the Mercer Street alternative at Seattle Center, so DT2, and sort of transitions to that central Interbay alignment via Armory Way, as Emily was pointing out earlier. This is, of course, this isn't elevated, and we're slightly below grade, so you'll see that, but many of the context, essentially the location is the same, and so the context and adjacencies are very similar here. Main difference, again, station platform and the station and the guideway are below grade, so rather than being elevated 35 feet, we're now 35 feet below grade. And so this would be an open cut essentially from the portal, which would be right south of Prospect Street, right around here, to where it transitions to at-grade structures behind the Magnolia Bridge on-ramp facility just to the north of here, around Gaylord Street. So because that grade is changing, you would really start to have kind of too shallow of a cut to really introduce lid structures to potentially recover some development capacity. But we'll study that or show that in a little bit. The station, again, two station entrances, one right at Prospect Street, one a little bit to the north, close to Lee Street. The cross section here at left shows that sort of entrance structure pavilion with vertical circulation down to the center platform. And in cross section, the relationship to Elliott Avenue and the layover looks very similar to the other, the elevated alternative that we're looking at. So transit integration, very similar here in terms of the stop pattern as the elevated configuration. Again, noting that bus layover facility, which would be a little bit tighter and would probably require a more robust retaining wall, given the fact that there's more footprint taken up at grade and not maybe as much space that could be reclaimed for this function at grade. Noting the opportunities for improved sidewalks here, as well as that signal and crossing at Elliott. Also an interesting opportunity here, given the retain cut profile of the station is potentially an opportunity to connect the Helix Bridge or extend the Helix Bridge to connect into Kinnear Park and potentially tie into the station entrance. So that would be something that, if this alternative moved forward, that could be evaluated in partnership with the city and others. And also pointing out here the pickup drop-off that could potentially be located adjacent to the Helix Bridge and adjacent to the transit facility that Expedia constructed just to the south of that bridge. So that's the overview of the alternatives, and I think I'm now going to ask Colin Drake from SDOT to walk us through some of the city's observations and considerations for this station location. Colin.
Thanks, Lon. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. Okay, great. So thanks for this opportunity to talk to the Design Commission. And I do want to thank you to Sound Transit for being incredibly thorough. I think you may, as the Design Commission listens to this, you may think that this is awfully brief in comparison, and maybe that's okay. Sound Transit has done a great job of providing the detail. So on the city team, our job is a little bit different. You know, rather than being as comprehensive as Sound Transit and taking a look at myriad different considerations, what we've asked ourselves is really to look at, you know, as we move toward a city position on a preferred alternative, what are the key differentiators? So with all the information that Sound Transit has presented, what are really the considerations that rise to the top and would drive the city's point of view, or a staff recommendation, and eventually a board member recommendation on a preferred alternative? And so I only have a couple of slides here, and unfortunately, particularly in the South Interbay in the Smith Cove area, the recommendation is a bit incomplete at this point because there's some uncertainty with regard to the North Portal location. But I'll do the best I can with the information that we have at this time. So Sloan went through a lot of different trade-offs specific to the Smith Cove station locations. And as we looked at those same trade-offs, we did note that the SIB1, the Gaylord station, would have the ability to access Expedia and Terminal 91 without also needing to cross Elliott, whereas the Prospect stations would need to cross Elliott in addition to crossing the BNSF tracks. However, as we think about the overall considerations here that would inform a city position on a preferred alternative, it really is tied to ongoing discussions about the North Portal location. The SIB1 station connects to a North Portal at Republican. And that portal, as it emerges from the downtown tunnel, would cross Elliott Avenue 3 times. The city has concerns about those Elliott Ave crossings, both during construction in terms of the impact to mobility on Elliott, and then during operation in terms of permanent lane reductions or sightline safety considerations, and also visual impacts of a guideway that crosses 3 times. So that's sort of the status of the discussion with regard to the Republican portal and the SIB1 station. The Prospect portal doesn't have those impacts to Elliott, but there's ongoing discussions about slope stability with the Queen Anne hillside. And so unfortunately, this discussion is a little bit still undecided and will continue to develop as we go forward. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, even before actually the DEIS came out, the interdepartmental city team discussed the relative trade-offs of each of these alternatives. And then as you know, since Sound Transit released the DEIS in January, and then over these next few months, as we participate in Sound Transit's engagement with the community, we'll continue to gather information that would inform a city preference on a alternative. At the end of April, we'll be transmitting our comment letter on the DEIS that will include comments on a preferred alternative. And then with our board members, Mayor Harrell and Council President Juarez, we will use the information that we have generated in our interdepartmental city staff team and with other city departmental leadership to inform their positions as the board works toward a vote in June or a board meeting scheduled for June at the moment, to confirm or modify the preferred alternative. And then next year we will continue our engagement. Yeah.
Colin, I just want to chime in that we're running over by about 15 minutes on our agenda. So if are you wrapped up? Yeah, great.
I'm wrapped up.
Okay. So commissioners, the Ballard Station presentation is supposed to start in 10 minutes. So we are tight. So please keep that in mind, about maybe 2 minutes each. Yeah, thank you. We'll
Great.
start with Elaine again. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm off mute. Really just had one or maybe just one question. What's the distance between the Gaylord Street station and the Helix Bridge?
So it's essentially a little bit over a quarter mile.
Okay.
So it's about a five. It would be about a 7. I would say probably a 7-minute walk.
Right. Okay. And along, a very busy traffic corridor. Anyway, okay, so I will make my comments. I mean, it appears that the Gaylord Street alternative really addresses long-term development in terms of being in that central location where it can kind of touch all these different points of Interbay, Expedia, the cruise ship terminals. There's enough bus service and connections along those corridors. I am probably interested in hearing more about some of these other challenges that were just brought up at the end of the meeting in terms of like, how does that really materialize? But I think on the surface, it appears that, I would support Gaylord Street. I think the other thing I would think about is that, in the big scheme of things, you're showing such, very low ridership at the station, like 2,600 boardings a day, which sounds really low to me. But I would not want to sort of lower the importance of this station. I was thinking about, for many people, it could be sort of their first access to public transit in the city of Seattle if they're coming off of cruise ship terminals. It's sort of like, hello, you've landed in Seattle and now let's create a really great experience for you. So it's also an opportunity for a number of people to potentially access the waterfront park. And so that may not have had access to it before. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. And as you think about, design and moving forward, Sloan, you were addressing how can you create better experiences sort of at grade? What's the TOD opportunities there? I think all of that is important and will really play a role in the success of that station moving forward. And then, of course, there's the bike trail that runs through there, too. So I think just a lot, there's like so many important connection points. And I think I'll just leave it at that for now. So thank you.
Matt, you're next in the order.
Sorry, I don't have any comments and questions at this time. I unfortunately missed a fair amount of this, so I'll just listen to others. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled by all the bus and other connections that exist in all three of these, but in particular what you presented as the preferred alternative. So just kudos on that. I'm wondering Sloan, can you talk a little bit about what kind of TOD would there be? Maybe just taking the preferred alternative.
Sure. So here, maybe I can, I'll reshare so we can to that. So here, kind of the challenge with all of the, as I mentioned, with all the Smith Cove station alternatives, because there are all these major constraints. You have the steep slopes, which are already a big technical problem, as well as a visual one. In terms of retained structures, more for the Prospect Street alternatives. Then you have the important freight corridor of Elliott and transit corridor and the BNSF tracks. You just have precious little space. And given the geometry here, you can see you just sort of end up with a very sort of awkward remnant parcel, which is something that we're really trying to avoid with really all of the other segments of this project. But just given all the constraints in this area, it's kind of unavoidable. So I think with this alternative in particular, if it moves forward as preferred, there really needs to be more thought in the next phase about how this would function. There is a little bit of space, sort of as you can see, between columns that you might be able to site like a single story building, let's say, under the guideway, but then you have all sorts of access issues with the layover facility there. And also, I neglected to point out earlier, this is the King County, wastewater treatment site, or not treatment site, pump station, which isn't the most pleasant neighbor either. So there's just like a lot of constraints here, and if you look at the Prospect Street alternatives too, given the footprint of the guideway and the stations, just don't really have a lot of residual space for what we would consider a substantial TOD opportunity. So really here, the function is more about how are we achieving good connections between rail and different modes of transit? Are we getting the station to a place where it has a walk shed that's, relatively convenient to these sort of big destinations? And whatever redevelopment might occur in the future, on either east or west side of Elliott could also, provide additional destinations. That's a little bit more of like what we would call a community TOD focus.
That makes sense. Thank you. I'll just make a comment on that and then pass it along. I think once again, artists are pretty good at finding opportunities in liminal spaces. I think it's a really intriguing kind of nexus of transportation, cruise ship, passengers. There are some very interesting things going on here. So I appreciate you looking at these very unexpected spaces, possibly in new ways, and maybe getting community brainstorming around that for any of these particular alternatives. Thank you. And I'm passing it along to Erica.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you, guys. I think that this station actually has an amazing opportunity. And as Lane mentioned, this really is a welcoming site to thousands of people entering our city every day. And the importance of the legibility of this site, I think, is paramount. These are people that don't know our city, have never ridden our transportation system. And so when they get off and are sort of funneled through this byway for it to be understandable to them, I also really think that this is a remarkable opportunity for its strong connection to the Elliott Bay Trail that I think can't be understated. How I think what an opportunity this could be for bicycle transportation in that corridor. The fact that there's really wonderful bicycle connections to North Seattle at this point, and because you have these remnant spaces, that those could really be utilized, I think, to do something creative with bike storage in a way that hasn't been done in other stations across our network. So I think that opportunity really exists here in a fun way, and could easily be integrated with the artist community and sort of be a fun exploration. There's also obviously numerous kinds of transportation options now with like the scooter systems and bike rentals and all these things that people coming off the cruise ships could utilize, because sometimes I know they have really brief windows of opportunity to explore when they're stopping over. The other thing that I just wanted to bring up was I'm sure you guys are thinking about this with your connections, but I know in some of our other existing stations, there's been issues with metro circulators that sort of come to that station. Like I'm thinking about Soto and other sites that are in existing industrial areas, excuse me, that don't have immediate adjacent residences. So thinking really strongly about how circulators going from Magnolia and Queen Anne down are much more rapid fire than our existing currently, and how that works. And then lastly, I did notice that, you know, you do have just a few parcels that are adjacent on 15th. And if there could be some type of sort of overlay urban design framework for those parcels as they redevelop so that there is really strong frontage onto that street to create even minor opportunities for some retail development that accentuates the urban experience when you get off the station there. And I think that was about it. I'll hand it over to Molly.
All right. I love going after Erica because she hit things that I was excited about as well. So a lot of people mentioned the interest in that northern option, particularly because of its adjacency to cruise ship and to Gaylord. And so similarly, I was excited about opportunities in that area for something like a bike shop that functions regularly. There isn't a lot of opportunity in that area currently to, if you have bike repairs that have to happen, I'll say it's happened to me before. It's a great area to have that. It's a pretty kind of lonely area for a biker with a bike that breaks down. And the opportunity for cruise ship passengers to be greeted with bike rental. It reminds me of opportunities you see in like Amsterdam, right? When you get off of the train, there are real opportunities for longer term bike storage or rentals and like a real celebratory moment on a parcel that doesn't support a lot of other uses. Similarly, I'm interested in that bike trail connection to the Armory and how that will change the character of that portion of the bike network. It can be a difficult part of the bike network to navigate, particularly at night. There are areas in the current alignment of the bike network that get really tight. And so understanding how the area near the Armory and the new bike alignments will affect the bike experience going all the way from downtown up into Ballard, I think would be really valuable. Similarly, the adjacent redevelopment, any guidance from the city on how those parcels could redevelop would be great. Sloan, I appreciated hearing your thoughts on the equity toolkit lens specifically for Smith Cove, and will be interested to continue to hear about the piece that you mentioned, the sense of belonging for communities of color, how community engagement over time might impact the feeling of ownership of that space and how that might overlay with a feeling of belonging. And then one other big thing, so you mentioned on the more southern opportunities, you were talking about whether there would be opportunities to connect to the Helix Bridge. I'd be interested in seeing between the cut where you mentioned there may be opportunities for connections to the Helix Bridge. I'd be interested to know if that cut limits any of the potential connections to Queen Anne for those two options. So really seeing what are the potential connections to Queen Anne, even just as a dashed line on those drawings, and then understanding which ones are eliminated by a cut, which ones are enhanced by a cut, and so how those opportunities to the Helix connection could be a really important one above grade, but understanding if getting something like that with the cut then eliminates connections to the Greenway, I think that would be a real indicator of which of those options are preferable from a pedestrian experience and connectivity experience. That's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Molly. That was a great series of comments there. So I think I just have a couple of things to add. I was also in looking at the Prospect Street, the elevated and the cut one, the connection to the Helix Bridge and then potentially to Kinnear Park was the part that was intriguing, but that also led me to think, well, how many riders would really be coming that way? And should it be emphasized in that direction, or is it, really should the focus be more towards Gaylord and, who are we trying to capture I guess slope stability issues aside, I imagine there's a way to solve that in engineering, but if there is a, you know, a better location for ridership potential and connectivity, that seems like it should be a really strong factor. And then I love the ideas with the elevated Gaylord Street Station about different ways to think about those kind of remnant parcels that might result if they're not good TOD sites. I think, you know, in addition to art, that this could just be also an opportunity for, and not to, you know, advocate for my own profession, but, you know, landscape architecture, but green space, you know, in an area that's fairly harsh from a pedestrian experience. So, you know, this could be a place where you can get some nice canopy in and, you know, water quality maybe, and things like that. And so make it a sustainability, you know, improvements there that could also just enhance the experience of using that station as you get there by bike or walking. So, okay, so we're almost like, we're kind of still on agenda. So we're gonna dive right into Ballard.
Yes, yes, I can jump us right over there. I do want to just like pick up a couple of main themes I heard in this. One is the idea of the bike hub, particularly at that Gaylord Street location, is a really compelling one, and I'm glad to hear several commissioners advocate for that, because I think that is a really clear opportunity with this, you know, with that Northern Station location to sort of be a point of articulation in the existing waterfront trail network, and maybe a new alignment to overcome some of those constraints that you pointed out, in particular, you know, Molly and Erica. And it would be an like great site for like, you know, bike shop or something like that. And also, I think, you know, still plenty of space for really interesting landscape design and interventions. And then noted on the Helix Bridge connections, it's something that we've sort of grappled with too, because one of the challenges with the Smith Cove Station, particularly with respect to access to Queen Anne, you know, the west side of Queen Anne is you know, relatively low density residential. I mean, there's a strip along Olympic Boulevard and 10th West, and a little hub at Howe and 10th West. But you know, ultimately, where the density is in Queen Anne, folks are likelier to go to the Seattle Center Uptown Station to access on a daily basis, or, you know, really to get anywhere. So it is sort of like who is really trying to access station from Queen Anne? Where are they trying to access? And so that's where, as we were thinking through, especially Gaylord Street location, like there's an unimproved and currently I think closed actually connection called the Gaylord to Blaine trail that goes up the hill. That's what was one potential idea. And then of course the Howe Street stairs, but then you're sort of starting to really push farther north. So there's definitely some more challenges and you know, opportunities to think through once we sort of, you know, confirm or get direction on what the preferred is, and maybe even some other ideas that might come down the pike as we're concluding the public comment period. So with that, okay, I'll get this back over to Ballard Station. Okay, so Ballard. The RET themes here are very similar to Smith Cove in terms of the enhancing mobility and access, looking at those equitable development opportunities, and creating a sense of belonging. So we'll sort of point out some of these considerations as we're moving through the slides. We're looking at, as Emily mentioned in our earlier presentation, we're looking at essentially 4 station alternatives here, the elevated 14th and tunnel 14th and 1 and 2 noted here, and then a tunnel and elevated alternative at 15th alternative noted, or 15th Avenue noted as 3 and 4. Because we don't have the same topographic constraints here, we end up with a watershed that looks much more sort of regular. This is a combined 10-minute walk shed between the 14th and 15th Avenue alternatives. And this has been a subject of conversation at our CAG meetings, for instance. So the 14th alternatives are about 500 feet, 550 feet east of the 15th Avenue alternatives. So that does register, of course, in the walk shed. The 15th alternatives, within that 10-minute walk shed, you'd be able to reach Bergen Place, really sort of the heart at 22nd and Market of the historic district. Whereas with 14th, that 10-minute walk shed limit is a bit to the east, more at 20th. This is going to be obviously the terminus for the Ballard Link extension. So it's going to be a high ridership station, one of the highest in the corridor, since it will be a terminal facility for feeder bus service, as well as, of course, walk-up access from the urban village surrounding. So 13,000 daily boardings at the station, 51% of folks accessing on bus and 40% roughly on foot. As you can see here, a diversity of land uses in the vicinity of the station, since it's right sort of where that expanded urban village boundary that Vera was mentioning, as well as just to the south, the edge of the Ballard, of the BINMIC and industrial zoning, which Jeff mentioned is currently looking at new or enhanced density concepts. So this really could be providing not only access to a lot of homes and a lot of shops and so forth, but also jobs in the future. And so even this living and working in the station area 2040 is based on what the current PSRC projections are and the current zoning. So we could likely see that increase as new zoning concepts move forward from the city. Some of the major points of feedback to note in our engagement to date, probably the number one, of course, is the street environment of 15th Avenue Northwest and Northwest Market Street. It's a really busy intersection, difficult one for pedestrians. You have some weird things happening with grade at the intersection too, on the west side, southwest corner. So really, thinking through, particularly for the 15th Avenue alternatives, how that access environment could be ameliorated, but also for 14th, since that is sort of a crossing point. You have to cross it to get to the historic part of Ballard, which is noted here. Of course, we've heard concerns about the walking distance to the historic part of Ballard. And so that's a lot of our station context planning that you'll see is really about how do we sort of emphasize and improve the experience of that connection for both people who would opt to walk or bike or use micromobility or to take buses to get there. Also with 14th Avenue, thinking through that street environment. For instance, Yeoman Scott Park, the recent reclamation of the right-of-way, I'll say, as park space north of 58th, heading up towards Ballard High School. Could there be opportunities to really think about bringing some of those same treatments farther to the south in conjunction to the station, while also balancing the accessibility needs for industrial-oriented businesses south of the station area? So a lot of interesting adjacencies and tectonics to navigate in this station location. We're going to start with the preferred alternative, which is the elevated 14th Avenue alternatives. This we'll start with the context plan here. So Emily mentioned in her presentation that all the 14th Avenue alternatives straddle Market Street, so there are entrances on both sides of Market Street. This would be one block off of 15th. It would be right close to the recent office developments and Target that went in at 15th and Market. Ballard Market would be essentially catty corner from the north entrance. Some new residential developments, as well as the Safeway property, which would host a station entrance with this alternative, as well as an opportunity for equitable TOD. As we move south of 53rd, we transition, or I'm sorry, 54th actually, we transition into that industrial area. So we have urban village zoning sort of to the north and to the east in this image, and we have industrial zoning starting to transition in at 54th Street, which of course is changing in character with new breweries and other functions that incorporate production and retail into a footprint. So maybe some interesting mixing of those kinds of uses in this station area in the future. So the station entrances, there are 3 with this alternative. There's entrances on either side of Market Street, oriented to Market Street, as well as the third that's on the west side of 14th Avenue Northwest. And the stop pattern is really, or this entrance pattern is set up to ensure that we're really maximizing access from bus to rail transfers, as well as to get passengers closer to that, that western journey towards the heart of Ballard. The cross section shows the grade relationships here. So the station platform would be 55 feet above grade, transitioning from that high level fixed bridge that Dirk was talking about. And there would be the station entrances here at the Market and 14th grade, and a mezzanine with a pedestrian bridge spanning over 14th Avenue to get to that southwest station entrance. So, quite a bit of, different structures that would really be changing the feel of this intersection from what it currently is. This is showing the transit integration scheme for the elevated 14th station. So there are several routes converging on the station location. And I'll spend a little bit of time on the character of that network, because it is important for folks to understand that the network that we're planning for is the Metro Connects 2040 Vision Network that King County Metro developed in tandem with ST3. And that's really to ensure that the future network and service hours are sort of shifting from these long haul regional routes, in many cases that Link is replacing, to more of that feeder circulator service. And of course here we have the Rapid Ride D line, which currently serves the 15th Avenue corridor. In the future, that line would actually connect to and terminate at the station. So buses would be sort of coming off of 15th Avenue here, and then using the 14th Avenue stops for folks coming from Crown Hill, Loyal Heights, from Northgate, to access the station. But it's also going to be a destination for rapid ride routes coming from Fremont up Leary Avenue. So that would be utilizing the 14th Avenue Northwest corridor as well, transitioning to Market Street, as well as crosstown service, towards UW and Wallingford to the east, and to Sunset Hill, and points west and north, west of the heart of Ballard. So that informs the stop zone westbound and eastbound on Market. And then paratransit would be proposed to be north of Market on 14th Avenue Northwest on the east side, adjacent to that North Station entrance. The walking, rolling, and biking to the station, several things happening here. One is really looking at improvement to the frontage condition along Market Street, and sort of further activating that with potential transit-oriented development between 14th and 15th Avenues. And then also looking to the east, as Vera mentioned, with the extension of urban village zoning as redevelopment occurs, really sort of tapping into an improved sort of continuous sidewalk and frontage to 11th Avenue and even further to the east to 8th. This is also showing distributed bike parking zones near the different station entrances, acknowledging that the bike network here relies a lot on neighborhood greenway connections, for instance, at 53rd and up at 58th and 60th. And the fact that 14th Avenue, there's an opportunity to really think about how that could host more robust facilities to connect between all these east-west greenway and trail facilities, as well as connect those facilities into the station. And enjoying places around the station here, noting a couple of substantial opportunities for transit-oriented development on property that would be acquired to construct the project, and potentially also an integrated sort of joint development of that southwest station entrance that could be incorporated into that development. So that would present an opportunity to think about some of those frontage improvements on Northwest Market Street in integrated fashion with development and activation of that parcel between the station and the 15th Avenue Northwest and Market Street intersection. There's also a transit plaza, that would tie into that streetscape and frontage along 14th and Market Street. And the opportunity for TOD on the site or on these sites could, accommodate up to 400 homes and nearly 20,000 square feet of commercial space based on our preliminary assessment. So we're now going to look at the tunnel alternative, and a lot of the factors here are the same. So I'm just going to point out that whereas we were looking at an elevated station, sort of spanning the right-of-way and private property in 14th, now we're looking at a tunnel station. The tunnel would be entirely below the right-of-way in a cut and cover tunnel configuration. And that would have vertical circulation from platform, lateral movement over to the station entrances. And this is the cross section actually on the north side of Market. So it's not showing the fact that there would also be sort of a below grade span under 14th connecting the two station entrances on the south side of Market Street. So the station would be about 65 feet below grade at this point, which of course the grade is rising as we're moving to the north. The bus stops and the service pattern I was noting earlier would be exactly the same with this configuration, and as well as with the paratransit stops. And similarly, sort of a similar pattern of bike parking as well as connection between greenway and trail facilities, as well as sidewalks. The big difference here, of course, is that you don't have the elevated structure the elevated structure's presence at grade here. So more opportunity to sort of tie these entrances into development that would be happening above it. And noting here that with that extra footprint that could be jointly developed or integrated into adjacent development, 475 homes and nearly 500 residential units and more sort of commercial and or combination of commercial and industrial space possible with these different sites. So now we're gonna move one block to the west to the 15th Avenue alternative. This is the other preferred with third-party funding alternative. So it's a tunnel 15th Avenue station, and here the adjacencies are somewhat similar, except now we have an entrance on the west side of 15th, which brings riders closer and also avoids a necessary crossing of 15th to, for instance, the Swedish Medical Center and the heart of Ballard to the west, the heart of the historic district, Ballard to the west. It also shows that we have primary entrances really focus on the south side of Market, with an opportunity perhaps to explore partnerships to site a smaller entrance on the north side of Market, but that would really be contingent upon working with established development and property owners. This is a cross section through the 15th Avenue Tunnel Station. It's showing that pedestrian cross passage below 15th Avenue, tying together the west and the east station entrances, holding both corners of Market Street and 15th. And you can also see the vertical circulation down to the station platform. It'd be about 20 feet deeper than the 14th Avenue alternatives, just owing to a shorter tunnel run, and thus, and also need to clear the below grade structures of adjacent development to the north. Platform would be centered under 54th, so just south of Market Street. And then the transit integration scheme here is a little bit more complicated than the 14th Avenue alternatives. So we would have bus stops going eastbound and westbound, far side Market Street in both directions. And then we'd have the rapid ride remaining on 15th and stopping on both sides of the street that would have ready access to the primary station entrances. You do see there are a few stop zones and routes that would require one or maybe two street crossings to get to one of the current station entrances. So that was part of that earlier statistic that Emily was pointing out that might be able to be ameliorated if we can partner on an additional entrance north of Market. Paratransit would be farther to the south near 53rd Street. Pointing out walking, rolling, and biking. So similar opportunities for thinking about 14th Avenue as a bicycle corridor, stitching together these different east-west neighborhood greenway connections, but also an established greenway on 17th. So maybe thinking about facility upgrades there, and then looking at these lateral connections of or crossings of 15th on 53rd and 58th. And maybe even Market Street as sidewalk improvements and other frontage improvements are contemplated. And noting some opportunities for TOD and for placemaking and public space around the station. A substantial equitable TOD opportunity with these alternatives that could accommodate over 500 new residences, and substantial commercial and/or substantial commercial space as well, so retail or office integrated into that, or other sort of making or commercial spaces, as well as some thoughts in our early agency conversations about thinking about 54th Street as a potential festival street, so maybe sort of calming or looking at different pavement street treatments for the west end of that street at the 15th Avenue intersection to sort of foster a more integrated, consolidated public realm and frontage along 15th, and potentially even something that's more interior facing as well. And finally, the elevated 15th Avenue alternative, very similar to what we just walked through with the tunnel configuration. The main difference here is, of course, we have an elevated structure with straddle bents and structures sort of spanning the roadway. So it's a different physical condition, much different physical condition than the tunnel station that we were just looking at. But similar sort of station entrance placement pattern. You can see here the structure itself would be about 55 feet above grade. So very actually kind of similar in scale and bulk as the 14th Avenue station, just with a wider span of the pedestrian bridge, owing to the fact that the 15th Avenue right-of-way is much larger here. And that would connect to the different station entrances via a pedestrian bridge with vertical circulation up to a platform. There would also be a partial span of the platform into the right-of-way, so you can see there would be some potential street uses and travel lanes below the station structure. The bus stop pattern is the exact same as we looked at with the 15th Avenue alternative, as well as the bicycle, walking, and rolling considerations, with the notable addition or fact here of the elevated structure, which creates some things that would have to be carefully thought through in terms of sight lines and such. And the column placement does anticipate that in the current configuration, but if this moved forward, looking at that in greater detail and design. Slightly less potential development yield, again, owing to the elevated footprint, projecting a little bit further into the buildable area and the need for a setback from that structure. So it's about 500 resident units. Similar opportunities with Festival Street and public space. So it's a lot of information. I'm going to turn it over to Colin to walk through some of the city's observations, and then we'll Colin.
Thanks. All right, next slide. We only have a couple slides here, so this should be quick. So again, Sound Transit has laid out many more considerations than are going to show up on this slide. When the city interdepartmental team took a look at the trade-offs between the Ballard station locations, the ones we focused on, the elevated alternatives, there were concerns about the impacts from the bridge and the elevated guideway, noise impacts during construction, during operation, impacts to the natural environment due to in-water bridge work, and then navigation impacts during construction and operations, impacts to Fisherman's Terminal, greater business displacements, and undevelopable remainder parcels as a result of elevated guideway structures. When we were looking at trade-offs between 14th and 15th, the tunnel alternatives, the tunnel on 14th does have an entrance spanning Market, and that is desirable. The tunnel on 15th has an entrance spanning 15th Avenue Northwest. So ideally, there would be entrances spanning Market and spanning 15th Northwest to enable pedestrian crossings to occur underground and avoid surface conflicts between vehicles and pedestrians. So we'll continue to work with Sound Transit on those opportunities. But it really boiled down to, even though it's just a one block difference, the tunneled 15th alternative is that much closer to the historic core of Ballard, the existing density there, and farther from the existing maritime industrial uses that are to the east. And then we had additional concerns with the IBB3 alternative, the elevated 15th alternative, about disruption to the 15th Avenue Northwest corridor during construction. And then similar to our concerns about the South Interbay 1 alternative, the ongoing safety and sightline constraints when a roadway is straddling, or when an elevated guideway is straddling a roadway. So that's really the differentiators that the city identified. Next slide, please. And as Sloan discussed, when we take a look at the trade-offs between 15th and 14th, there's pros and cons for bus integration on each. I think as this discussion advances, we can continue to look at those. Our take was that 15th is better for transit integration, even with the consideration of Metro Connect's desire to have the D line terminate here. Also, the 15th Avenue alternative allowed for agency TOD on both sides of 15th, and that is an attractive opportunity for TOD. And that is the end of the city observations.
Thanks, Colin. So I think that takes us to Q&A. And I'm sorry, I wasn't looking at the chat, so it was. Oh, and then Vera had a clarification. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Vera just clarified that the urban village expansion already happened, so thanks for that. And I think we have until 12:30, so we'll start again with Elaine.
Great, thanks, Vanita. An initial question about the rezoning of the Ballard Urban Village. I should know this, but I was curious about what is the allowable height adjacent to 14th Avenue of those buildings?
I can take a brief second to just pull that up and respond to you in probably a minute. It varies. There are, neighborhood commercial zones nearby, also some low-rise zones, and so it's with a lot of our zoning, it's not a smooth line and an obvious
right.
condition.
Okay.
So I'll take a look.
Well, I'll continue on with some of my comments while you look that up. And I know we only have a short amount of time here. I think, Ballard is such an established neighborhood. It's got a thriving commercial district on Ballard Avenue and, and also on Northwest Market Street. And, I think it's sort of critical that we get it right. And it definitely made sense to extend the urban village. But I sort of, I have concerns about our major public transit infrastructure moving further away from that established, thriving community. It's a long block between 15th and 14th. It's already not very pleasant to cross 15th. And so I also have serious concerns about the elevated alternatives in that neighborhood. It's one of the reasons I'm asking about the height. I think scale, once again, is really important. We had an opportunity to walk this area, I think it was last summer, and start to look at what an elevated guideway would look like next to the existing buildings that are there. And they're either the same height or even higher than those existing buildings. I think is it the polyclinic that's there on the corner, or the Target that is there on the corner. And so, how we enter that neighborhood, I think, is really critical. So, I'll just say right now that the preference from my standpoint would be for a below grade alternative. The other thing, I see that you're trying to think about connections over to the business district. It's already a long walk. Many people don't like to walk from 15th over to Ballard Avenue and continue to drive. But so any kinds of better connections, obviously, are key. You were showing some of your festival streets maybe being built out to the east. You might think about whether a festival street could be a way to help filter people maybe more pleasantly over towards Ballard Avenue. Let's think, what else did I have on here? I was just thinking also, in terms of that sequence of how you arrive at Ballard, arriving on 14th Avenue, it's very hard to visualize today what that might look like. But, the continued development in that area is sort of bigger box. And I just think that, it's a very different experience than, I guess, just some of the scale if you were to arrive over on 15th, and there's just more diversity and scale of those buildings. So I just think that there's a lot of critical things that we really need to think about, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Great. I'll go really quickly. I don't really have anything to add to Lane's comments, which I think really covered a lot of the concerns. I would just reiterate that it appears to me that the below grade alternatives have much greater potential, I think, for a successful integration with the neighborhood and for a successful pedestrian experience. So those below grade options, I'm glad to see them on the table. I think I understood that they were preferred, or that the 15th underground option was preferred, if I understood that slide correctly, but just want to support that direction. Thanks.
clarify, both 14th and 15th tunnels were identified as preferred with third-party funding at the transition from alternatives development to the draft EIS. And now, as Emily shared, the difference in cost between the elevated 14th and tunnel 14th are converging. The tunnel 15th would still be, slightly higher in cost based on our current estimate. But also, I think it's like $100 million delta currently.
Thank you.
Thank you for these. I wanted to piggyback onto what Sloan said very early on about the joint racial equity toolkit efforts between Sound Transit and the city. And it's been occurring to me several times today that the two stations you spoke about, Interbay and Ballard, have different conditions for artists. Ballard has long had artists living and working in spaces in Ballard, and they're being pushed out by gentrification. Interbay may have some brand new opportunities. I'm going to make a bit of a pitch for TOD, including artist live work space, as a response to the RET, which mentions employment, opportunities for equity, and sense of belonging. I think there's something very, very strong about living and working in a particular space in a particular neighborhood, contributing to that economy that can be very, very powerful for people who cannot afford to live and work in the city in other ways. And and many times these are artists, and they're artists that we may not even know are working in the city because they don't have that kind of visibility. The city of Everett has a great space that I can provide some additional information on if anybody's interested about actually approaching that kind of space with a lens of equity. And thank you very much for everything today. Passing it along to Erica.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I would secondary the idea of having a TOD focused on work, live, artist space. I just wanted to sort of further iterate what Matt and others have said, that I think the underground option in this location is really critical. I particularly also think that, I know it is a little bit more expensive, but the idea of pulling this access point as close to the center of the Ballard community really is powerful. I'm just thinking about the utilization of 14th and sort of the right of way there, and transportation being pretty challenged in such a tight configuration. And there are challenges that come when a street becomes more of a transit oriented street. And when you're pulling that transit usage closer to smaller scale usages, I see that as creating more conflict than it would on 15th, which is already somewhat accustomed to that level of movement. I also think that the above ground option here is really counterintuitive to the opportunity for the innovative zoning that was talked about earlier from the city, that we're trying to really bridge the transition from a mixed-use neighborhood into an industrial one, and having a large-scale infrastructure sort of slice through that is creating challenges that we've seen historically happen all over this city. And I wouldn't want this to, again, sort of cause that level of hardline differentiation between a central community and an industrial space. It just does not do good things for the integration of our communities. And I do think this could be a really wonderful new foray into that different kind of zoning, but it would be minimized drastically by having such a large scale object, sort of bifurcating that. I also did think that it was a important sort of note to the possibility of adding an entrance if there was a tunnel option on 15th on the north side of Market. I do think, I know it does lead to some challenges, but if people could access without having to make that cross over that large street, I think it would be much more comfortable, and it seems minimal in the scheme of things. So I wanted to to support that. And also just really, I appreciated Colin's impact from the city. I agreed fully with their notes. And so I wanted to add my commentary to that. And I'll pass it to Molly again.
All right, thank you. And so first and foremost, I'll also express a preference for the below grade alternative. And I think Erica stated that like really clearly and beautifully, so I won't reiterate that. I will be interested in reviewing the circulation and wayfinding, particularly with those underground stations. So looking at whether we have switchbacking escalators, what that entry into the station experience is going to feel like, and how it differs between options. I'm also interested in reviewing what public space in each of those options will look like, and what that overlap is with ongoing parking expectations, particularly when we look at something like Safeway, where you're converting on either side, whether you're on 14th or 15th, and converting parking to transit opportunities. My question would really be, what are Safeway's expectations for parking longer term, and where will we have opportunities for public space, and how do those interact with each other from a user experience perspective? I also just appreciated seeing on 14th the Gimmonscap Park extension considerations. I thought that was, if 14th were chosen, while I prefer 15th, I appreciated seeing that character extended as well as connectivity extended. I was also interested, I'll be interested in understanding what is bike and pedestrian priority. So looking at the call out of 53rd for bike, really doing some clear thinking about whether it's 53rd or 52nd. Right now you have a lot of those breweries emerging on 52nd. So really understanding where is their activity now and where is their planned activity. I'm also going to be curious on 54th about the interactions between drop-off, and you had called out a potential festival street there. So it would be interesting to continue to review not only what is the overlap in terms of numbers, but also what is the character of that space, and how is it indicating, like on the ground plane or in a variety of spatial ways, materially, et cetera, how is it indicating that it is a bike and pedestrian priority space even when vehicles have access, or how can we have clarity for drop off and reduce the overlapping impacts of the drop off, which will be necessary in this location, and the bike and ped desire for that space. And then I'd also just be curious, so in thinking about those things, the bike and ped priority, particularly moving east-west, so knowing that we're moving west to historic Ballard, but also you'll have pedestrians moving to the east to housing in Fremont. There's a lot of walking in that area. So I'd be curious to hear how the Design Commission can support your ongoing efforts and communications between agencies about those connections and priorities, and really understanding what that long-term network looks like for pedestrians, for walking, biking, and rolling. Yeah, thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Molly. I don't have a lot of new comments. I think that, you know, it's pretty clear that we've supported the tunnel options. You know, in looking at the elevated 15th, especially, it's a street that's already really challenged from a pedestrian experience, and then this, you know, wide straddle bend over a already wide highway-like feeling roadway is just not going to help. You know, in looking between you know, 14th and 15th locations, I think I mean, I guess I would be interested to understand, like, when you're talking about 13,000 users, are as kind of Elaine, I think, was suggesting, more of those 13,000 users coming from the west as opposed to the east, or where is the population growth? Because there's a lot of redevelopment potential on the east side of 15th, right, in that whole brewery district. So there might, that future population of density might be really proximate to 14th. So I think looking future forward on that would be important. when selecting alignments. And then, there was mention that someday, eventually, and way off in the future, this line could continue to the north. So I don't know to what extent that routing would impact as well these choices. I think if one of the outcomes of this project is we get better pedestrian crossings of 15th, that would be, and Market, that would be really great, because it is just it's a barrier from a pedestrian experience and a bike experience, and to what extent the traffic calming can occur within this roadway would be a real win all around. So and I don't have any other comments, Michael. Any close?
I just, with 1 minute left, I just have to say these rapid fire briefings have just really exceeded, I think, all of our expectations due in part to the rigor that Sound Transit has brought to their presentations. We're trying to keep a compiled list of the issues that are being raised to figure out what type of communication that the commission wants to make relative to the work that's done so far. I don't know that we have an answer to that question, but we're working on it. So I guess in closing, I'd just like to again say thank you, Sloan and team, for one in a series of excellent presentations that advanced the commission's work here. And certainly the partnership with the city as well really helped understand context and city direction in these neighborhoods. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity about it. A lot of great work and great partnership with the city. So thank you to our city partners too in all of this.
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate the collaboration that's been happening in these last few reviews we've gone through. It's just been great. So I know it's work.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Commissioners, why don't we plan to come back at 1 o'clock? And for business, we have business from 1 to 2. Again, thanks to Sound Transit and the presentation partners for an excellent morning session. And commissioners, we'll just see you at 1 o'clock.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you April 7th.
Thanks. Bye.